The story starts in a city falling apart, with fire all around. This is the Empire of Antares, the capital of Rifenheim. Evil forces from the Empire are destroying the kingdom, but the soldiers are fighting bravely. During the attack, the commander said that the demon they had summoned had crushed their army of 2 million. The soldier added that 200,000 were killed and 300,000 were wounded in that horrific attack. The commander shouted to his warriors that the demon king had thought to destroy their country and paint the world black, but today it would all end. He told them that their heroes would defeat the demon. In the center of Garak, the great demon castle, hero Alex von Elaine shouted that there would be no more terrible acts. It was time for the monster to return to the darkness. In front of Alex and the others, the demon king Reifenhard sat on his throne. The holy sword Cyrus drew his weapon and shouted at Reifenhard that they would destroy him and end the history of the Dark Empire. Reifenhard sighed and replied that it was all sad. He had spent quite a bit of effort on her. He also asked why they call it the Dark Empire if it was called Antares. After all, they have a shining sun too. The martial arts expert, Teslan, began to shout that demons were being cultivated there, and that if Reifenhard disappeared, the vicious monsters would as well. Reifenhard smiled and wondered what these vicious monsters were originally like. They had only been trained in human tactics. They had been mistreated their whole lives. So Reifenhard taught them self-defense, and they ended up behaving just like humans. Then Reifenhard asked if they had already defeated the 4 heavenly kings. Teslan replied that he had disciplined them, and the orcs were no longer a problem. Reifenhard got angry and started yelling that they really meant that Tate, the bravest and greatest orc. Orcs are just regular hunter-gatherers. They might look wild, but they're not able to betray their family or friends. They protect the weak and fight the strong. It's not fair to call them monsters. Teslan crossed his arms and said, sounding proud, even trolls who are nauseated paid for their sins. Reifenhard was shocked. He knew that trolls were scary on the outside, but they were just nature lovers turned spiritualists. St. Ellen said that the evil dwarf who honored the god of darkness was also caught up with justice. Reifenhard grabbed his head and realized that even Michelin was dead. He couldn't understand why these people in front of him were so arrogant, thinking that everyone but Seer and the 12 deities were evil creatures. Said they had also sent the dark elf to the next world because he was no match for her magic. When he heard this, Reifenhard became very angry. He shouted loudly that Cirrus was dead too. Reifenhard's aura changed color, and lightning bolts of anger flashed from his eyes. He said he had asked to die. Teslan began to say that Reifenhard had finally shown what he was really like. He added that the dark elf was a demon who had gone over to the dark side, and they did not spare such creatures. Reifenhard replied that she was not a dark elf, and that their skin was darker than hers. But humans had cut down all the trees, so she had to flee into the wasteland. Alex grabbed his sword, which glowed brightly, and declared that he would avenge the dead with it. Reifenhard realized that no one was listening to him. He used a special technique and his eyes turned black. He asked who would avenge the dead from the other world. Alex replied that it was nasty, since the monsters wouldn't have fallen into darkness if he hadn't been in the world. They would have lived in peace. Reifenhard realized that his words were falling on deaf ears. For them, creatures from another world are better than dark creatures who don't want to live as slaves. He decided to become the demon king they wanted him to be. He gathered and concentrated all of his anger into energy and released it. Then he said his name was Reifenhard, and he was an ordinary high mage. Humans don't see creatures from another world as equals. They see elves as kind servants who live a long time. Dwarves are seen as useful only as slaves and miners. Orcs are good for hard labor. Trolls are used to make healing potions. These creatures are seen as mindless slaves. Reifenhard was shocked by how deep their forgotten culture was. He learned everything about their culture. He learned spirit magic from the elves and witchcraft from the trolls. By combining these two, Reifenhard became the first person in history to reach the 10th circle of magic. Talking with them changed his view of life. He started to rescue them because he could no longer stand to see them enslaved. As his territory grew, it became harder to deceive people. People started attacking them. The people kept invading, destroying, and plundering, and they kept retreating. They only defended themselves against attacks, but eventually took over more land, and their city grew. It grew bigger and bigger until it became the Antares Empire. Reifenhard had built an entire empire, but he didn't hate humans. He believed that creatures from another world were as good as humans. They weren't out for revenge. This was evident in the end. While everyone in Antares loved it, they believed the Demon King's spell spoke for them. Reifenhard understood why they felt that way because his army consisted of ogres and goblins, who were not known for their beauty. But killing them for that reason was unacceptable. Reifenhard started shouting that it was his duty to defend his empire. He said that if there was a law that allowed murder, he would destroy it and create a new one. Reifenhard defeated Alex with one hit. He said he was sure Alex was dubbed a hero because he was good with a sword, but in fact he was not skilled at anything. Reifenhard said that heroes only survive to the end in fairy tales. Alex is strong, but not strong enough. In life, you should focus on one thing at a time. Reifenhard destroyed one opponent after another, and only the martial arts king, Teslan, remained. A man renowned for his strong body. It wasn't hard to defeat the others, but Teslan was different. He wasted no time. He's not someone you'd want to face. Reifenhard used one technique after another, but Teslan did not give up. At one point, Teslan flew above Reifenhard and shouted that they would win. Reifenhard used magic to block his attack. Teslan replied that it was to be expected of a demon king, but Reifenhard felt like he was going to die. He needed to kill Teslan, but right now there was no way to win. Teslan was getting closer and closer. He said he would judge the Dark King. Reifenhard grabbed his head and said that Teslan had won. Teslan replied that he believed the others would finally be freed from his demonic control. Reifenhard wanted to give up, but he couldn't. He asked Teslan what it meant to be free of their shackles and whether he thought it was their fate to be slaves. Reifenhard was fed up with this nonsense and used the space and time technique. He had found an ancient artifact that had the power to manipulate space and time. There is magic in it that even Reifenhard, a mage of the 10th circle, could not understand. Teslan became furious and began shouting, asking what he was going to do. Reifenhard replied, rolling back space and time. This spell can turn back time and go against God's plan. He didn't know if the spell would work, but he had nothing left to lose. He shouted to Teslan to stop him if he could. Teslan ran at him and hit him with his fist. Reifenhard was thrown back, still screaming that he could not die. A huge white flash shook everything around it. A new sunny day has arrived. In the forest, there is a wooden house. It is early morning, and the birds are singing their tinkling songs. The wind blew the window shade. That sound, that warmth, that pleasant feeling. Reifenhard opened his eyes and asked himself if he was still alive. He stood up and wondered if he had really done it. He had no idea how he'd done it. He thought, who would have thought it would work? Then the man got out of bed, unable to figure out where he was. He thought he must have traveled back in time, but this place was not familiar to him. He stared out the window for a long time, trying to see something familiar. He wondered how old he was now. The man looked at his body and thought that anyone would be jealous of one of these. Those muscles made him feel strong and sure of himself. And then Reifenhard realized something was wrong. He noticed a bunch of calluses on his hands, his whole body scarred. A mage only needs to know how to use spells. What use your biceps? It was strange for Reifenhard to speak of himself in the third person, but he had been irresistible in his youth. Reifenhard clearly remembered that when he had grown up, even the elven women had been crazy about his looks. The guy walked over to the mirror and was shocked. He couldn't understand what was wrong with his face. Where had the graceful body gone? He looked more like a gorilla now. Reifenhard tried to piece together the chain of events. What had happened? Did the space-time rollback spell not work? Was that why he was in a stranger's body? But this face seemed very familiar to him. Reifenhard realized that he had not gone back in time, which meant that there had been a castling with this man's soul. Thick brown eyebrows, a look of steadfast persistence, and also a stubborn face. If you let go of the beard and grow twice as tall, is this really the martial arts king Teslan? Suddenly someone started calling loudly for Teslan. The door opened, and a man of gigantic size entered the house. He told the guy that the sun was already at its zenith, and to stop snoozing to your heart's content. All living things were already awake. Teslan stood in shock. The man asked why he had relaxed and still hadn't gone outside. The shocked guy asked who he was. The man was surprised and said he was looking at him as if he was seeing him for the first time. Then he sighed heavily and told Teslan that he was having another bout of amnesia. He also reminded the boy that it was time to realize that this wasn't going to fly. He then grabbed Teslan by the head and dragged him outside, telling him it was time to go to practice. And then Reifenhard realized that from the looks of it, this man was Teslan's teacher, the strongest fighter on the continent, former martial arts king Gerard Krom. Meanwhile, Gerard had Teslan tied to a tree. The boy was shocked. He asked to stop and listen to him. Gerard asked him to calm down as he was too talkative today. Then he took the stick and said it was time to start. Gerard began to deliver one blow after another to Teslan's body. The boy screamed in pain and tears sprang from his eyes. All over, the exhausted boy couldn't figure out what was going on. Meanwhile, Gerard didn't stop. Suddenly, Reifenhard remembered the elf Cirrus. He said goodbye to her, as he thought this was where he would die. Gerard noticed that Teslan's hands had changed, becoming soft. He wondered if he had amnesia. Gerard began to say that their martial clan, the Indestructible Hall, labors to the seventh sweat. According to tradition, their methodology is simple, silly, and excessive, so the students often suffer from short-term memory loss. Gerard was going through the same thing. He smiled and said that there was a tool for every task. Gerard told Teslan that he would hit harder, and then the guy would come to his senses. At that time, Reifenhardt thought only of surviving such a thing. Gerard began to say that humans invented weapons to offset their worthlessness. Weak bodies made them cover themselves with shields and armor. An enraged Gerard walked up to the guy and started yelling that they were all pathetic, couldn't overcome their weaknesses, shameful, and they can do everything and more. Reifenhardt thought about the fact that this was the first time he had heard such absurdity. Gerard kept shouting that man is like steel. The more he hardens, the stronger he becomes. He tells Teslan that he chose him for a reason. He believes Teslan will become steel, and there is no limit to his strength. Gerard then calmed down and told the lad that not everyone can achieve success by diligent training. Just as high-grade iron turns into steel, only a select few can aspire to steel physics, and Gerard found such a man. Suddenly Gerard began to beat Teslan again. He told him to think of the ocean, and that it swallowed everything but did not weaken, and that there was an ocean inside him that needed to be released. Reifenhardt wondered what kind of nonsense that was. Out of desperation he thought of the sea, the ocean, and also of Cirrus. Finally it was over, and Gerard said that was enough for today. The exhausted boy fell to the ground and couldn't believe he was still alive after that. He then sat down on his knees, hugged himself, and began to give thanks for such a strong body. Gerard called the boy over to rest. Suddenly, Reifenhardt saw Jeffrel's leaves and petals in front of him. Is this a healing potion? He knew that one such bottle cost 10 silvers, and here was a whole tub. Teslan told Gerard that he had heard that the queen kept her skin young by bathing in milk, but that was a whole other level. He asked Gerard what the healing bath was. Gerard replied that the steel needed to cool down after forging. The boy realized that the body's recovery from such a beating is aided by auras and potions. Then it is time to rest and grow stronger, bypassing any sickness. Now Reifenhardt realized that to call such a technique insane would be a mistake. He remembered that in the battle with Teslan he had felt its power, plunged into the bathroom, and realized that he was in the past after all. But there was only one question on his mind. Is there a young Reifenhardt? Can two copies of a soul be in the same dimension? There are two hypotheses. First, young and adult Reifenhardt coexist in young Reifenhardt. And secondly, Reifenhardt's body now contains the soul of Teslan, the king of martial arts. After a while, Gerard brought a huge plate of meat several times the size of the guy and told him he had to eat it all, because after hard work, you need to restore your energy reserves. Teslan immediately began to eat. Now a light jog in the mountains for better digestion. The weighted Teslan was barely climbing. Gerard asked him what was wrong, if he was tired, or maybe they should continue their morning workout. The boy started yelling that they shouldn't. Gerard then told him to climb a tree and do pull-ups. The boy was wondering how long this hellish workout would last. After a while, the exhausted lad lay on the bed, saliva flowing from his mouth, and he thought about being reborn as a young Teslan. He still couldn't figure out if this would have any effect on the future him. If the events unfolded as they had last time, what would happen when the two souls came into contact with each other? The uniqueness of each soul is an inviolable rule of this world. So if luck turns, the soul ceases to exist. He knew that young Reifenhardt would not be a mage for another 10 years. And right now he was studying day and night, reading books in Delphia's magic tower, so the chance of bumping into him tended to zero. But what if Teslan has taken possession of Reifenhardt's body? Then he will definitely come after him. The recipe for his invincibility is simple, training in a special method. But with such a weak body, there's no hope. You can only train with a master using this technique, so no one can do it alone. But he'll probably find someone. Reifenhardt decided that his first priority was to escape from this prison. The boy rushed to run into the woods. He kept repeating to himself that he would escape, no matter the cost. Suddenly Gerard was sitting on a rock in front of him. He asked where his disciple was going. Gerard told him that he was trying to escape again, because he'd been quiet for a month, and this was the 9th time he'd tried to escape. If this keeps up, it's going to be double digits. Reifenhardt began shouting that he was not Teslan. He gave his real name and said he was a mage. Gerard laughed and said that he had never told him such a legend before. Then Reifenhardt did not know how to tell him the truth. Gerard said that the last time Teslan had said that he had come from another world and that he had seen gods and dragons. The boy asked what had happened before. Gerard said that he used to be a master on the eastern mainland of the Huang Empire, in a place called Murim, and was reborn into this body. Then Gerard clapped his hands and said that it was more convincing this time, and that he was good for trying. Now it was time for bed. Reifenhard cursed this old man, but he didn't despair and thought that today he had failed, but tomorrow he would definitely succeed. Even though his escape plan failed, he'll remember it well. And Reifenhard isn't going to stay here forever. After that incident, he tried to escape several more times. But Gerard caught him and said that when he was young he was just like that. Reifenhard even tried to swim away, but Gerard is not so easily fooled. All the tricks are familiar to him. Gerard told the lad that there was no need to worry. It was worth a little patience, and the reward wouldn't be long in coming. Reifenhard gave up any thoughts of running away from the old man who was nicknamed the Devil simply because he didn't know how to give up. Gerard told him that in the 130 years these trainings have existed, they have managed to come up with a myriad of ways to prevent a student from escaping. But in all of history, there have never been people who have tried to fake illness or fatigue for the sake of getting away from here. Reifenhard realized that even if he was lucky enough to escape from this place, the old man would scour the entire continent from edge to edge just to find the fugitive and bring him back. That's why Reifenhard decided it was easier to get permission and go down the mountain. Overflowing with love, Reifenhard spent 2 years. Gerard is proud of his apprentice, for he has finally awakened his aura. Reifenhard had heard that even Cyrus, who was nicknamed the Holy Sword, had awakened his aura after the age of 20. So to awaken before that age could be considered an achievement. Gerard told the lad not to be so surprised, as such events were commonplace for their training. And if one stimulates one's survival instinct along with physical training for a long time, the will to live will increase one's stamina, which in turn will manifest as an aura. Gerard suggested moving on to the next step. Reifenhard got excited and asked if they were going to learn normal martial arts. The boy thought it wouldn't be long before he could get out of here. And then Gerard said he was going to spar with him. When Reifenhard heard this, he was horrified. And so 3 more long years passed in this confinement. The kingdom of Basel, the southern lands, the Racked Mountains. Strong, huge, and courageous Reifenhard in the body of Teslan stands by a waterfall. He carefully looked at the rock and suddenly used the tribulation horn technique. His aura shone with a bright yellow light. He hit it a few more times and said to put a little more effort in. A horn of distress, it is a strike that is produced by concentrating power in one part of the body. Because of the horn-like appearance of the aura, he so nicknamed this ability. Reifenhard finished and thought that he needed to hone this skill to stage for some time. A blow sending out all 9 waves could kill even a god. And as far as he knew, Teslan's limit was the 7th. And even Gerard could only reach the 8th of the 9. Reifenhard remembered that his mentor had said that he could only descend the mountain when he reached the 4th stage. For the first time in a long time, Gerard went to a village near the mountain. He hoped he would stay there longer and have a drink. Reifenhard would have taken this opportunity to try to escape. But now he wanted to complete his endurance training. Suddenly, Reifenhard used Delpher's technique and began to cast a spell to make a projectile become out of thin air to hit his enemy. The guy then released the projectile and called it an air bullet. However, the projectile barely hit the tree. Reifenhard realized his body was failing, but at least he had a good memory of everything he knew about magic before. But he has a mana problem, and that burly man's body seems to resist controlling magic. Can Reifenhard become a magician? Suddenly the guy felt some kind of energy, and it didn't look like human energy. Suddenly an orc appeared from behind a tree. Reifenhard was surprised, and the orc told the guy to pretend he didn't see him, and then the orc wouldn't kill him. Reifenhard assumed the orc was about 3 or 4 years old, judging by his size. He looked like a fugitive, probably escaped from some arena. And also the guy noticed that the orc was trying to negotiate, and Reifenhard himself was not hostile. A noble race indeed, not wanting unnecessary killing. The lad asked the orc if anyone was following him. The orc was surprised and asked Reifenhard how such a man knew the language of grace. The lad replied that it was thanks to one fateful encounter. Then the orc bowed his head and said that the Reifenhard was right, and he was being pursued. Reifenhard said he wanted to help and asked the orc if he would trust him. The orc replied that Reifenhard knows the language of grace, and he is like a brother to him. The orc felt the boy's sincere kindness in his soul. He told Reifenhard, however, that helping him would bring him trouble. Reifenhard realized that the orc was of noble blood, since he was so eloquent. He replied that he had an opportunity to help, and it was worth trusting. The guy then used a technique and told the orc that his magic would cover him. The orc was surprised and asked the guy if he was a mage. Reifenhard asked if it was so strange. The orc replied that with a body like that, it was really surprising. The orc then entered the portal and told the lad that he would gratefully accept his kindness. Suddenly, at that moment, the shouts of the pursuers were heard. One of them was saying that he had to go through all this for a few paltry coins. A crowd of warriors approached the lad and asked if he had seen a young orc here, and they would give him a gold coin for the information. The other warrior was surprised and asked what other gold coin they were promising him. The warrior replied that no one would give him anything and they would just listen to the guy. Reifenhard folded his arms and replied that there was no way he would tell them. The warriors were surprised and noticed the orc's footprints. They realized he was somewhere nearby. Reifenhard sighed and thought that a simple spell didn't even hide the marks. He had told the warriors that his dwelling was his, and he couldn't just let them in. The commander-in-chief began to shout that this guy was crazy, and how dare a degenerate from the backwoods block their way. The warriors started yelling for the kid to stop fooling around and get out of the way. Some said the little bastard had a great body, but it didn't matter to them, since he was just a kid. Reifenhard concentrated his energy and began to remember his teacher's words that his fists were deadly weapons, and even a light swing could kill someone. Reifenhard asked his teacher mentally what he should do, and he received the answer that he should be appropriately merciful to the weak. Reifenhard thought that given that he could fight with his bare hands more easily than with weapons, having the latter was a mercy. The guy took the weapon in his hand and told the warriors not to be afraid, for if he struck with it, a clan practicing indestructible warrior training focuses on fighting without weapons, but that doesn't mean training with them is completely absent. The warriors got angry and started yelling that this degenerate had taken a club. They started laughing that this guy was acting like he had skills. Reifenhard pounced on them and began to scatter the warriors in different directions one by one. Then the other warriors tensed up and agreed to attack altogether. That way there's a better chance of defeating this madman. The goal of training with weapons is not skillful fighting skills, but rigorous student training. The main technique of this technique is to strike the entire body of the opponent. There is no defense. Suddenly, one of the warriors managed to strike Reifenhard's back with his sword. Reifenhard wondered to himself and thought how come the sword didn't leave a scratch. He asked himself if his body was definitely human. This was too much. The best part of this clan's art is the refusal to kill the enemy. So the guy would scatter the warriors and tell them not to worry, since they wouldn't die anyway. And even if the joints tear and the bones break, they still won't die. Finally, the guy scattered all the warriors, and only the commander-in-chief was left. He called the guy a scoundrel and asked him his name. Reifenhard immediately struck back and said that it wouldn't be fair for his friends to be left alone in such a position. The warriors started to help each other up and started to get out of there. One last time they thanked the guy for the opportunity. Reifenhard sighed and thought their beating had been quite fun. Too bad it was all over. The boy even thought about taking on his own students and giving them a good whipping. He hadn't realized how much the clan's philosophy had affected him. Suddenly an orc appeared and thanked his savior, saying that he would not forget this day for the rest of his life, and would definitely repay such kindness. Reifenhard was surprised and asked if it was normal for a warrior to bow his head so easily. The orc replied that the boy had first saved his life, then opened a new path, and now he was his mentor, and when the time came, he would bear his sword for him. A mentor in orc culture is a life coach, a revered person. It is a kind of human lord that a knight serves. The orc bowed to the boy and asked his name. The boy smiled and was about to answer that his name was Teslan, but after a moment he answered that he was Reifenhard Wald and Teres. The orc replied that he would remember the name. Reifenhard replied that this world was in the power of men and asked the orc where he was going. The orc replied that the continent was vast, and there must be room for him. If not, he would rather die a wanderer than live as a slave. Reifenhard had told him that beyond the Racked Mountains, a fortnight's journey southeast, lay an unnamed wasteland, a place their kind called the Land of Trails. Guy told the orc to go there, as he had heard of orcs lurking there, the Blue Bear tribe. The orc went on his way and said goodbye. Reifenhard shouted after him and asked the orc what his name was. The orc stopped and replied that he was the son of a mole, the heir to the Lath Sequin, and his name was Tate. Reifenhard felt as if he had been doused with cold water and stood there in shock. He couldn't believe that this guy was Tate. One of the 4 heavenly kings is the great warrior Tate. He was the leader of the Blue Bear tribe, and later became the great leader of the orcs. Reifenhard wondered if Tate had met the real Teslan in a past life. After all, given his character, he wouldn't have helped the orc. The flow of the original story seemed to be broken. Reifenhard exhaled and thought it was truly a blessed encounter. He watched Tate follow his path and began to remember all the people close to him from his past life. He considered Tate his friend and brother. Reifenhard told himself that they would definitely meet again. Another 6 months had passed since that strange incident. Gerard continued to train his apprentice and showed him the chi projectile. Poor Reifenhard thought this was too much. He applied a spiral defense to repel Gerard's blow. Gerard praised the student and said it was very good and his defense is getting better every day. Gerard then chuckled and told the guy that he remembered, as if it was yesterday, how he had tried to pretend to be Reifenhardt. Reifenhardt sighed and replied that there was no reason to remember the events of 6 years ago. Gerard replied that it had been 10 years since he had started training, and he had gotten much stronger since then. Gerard was worried about why he was still so small. Reifenhardt was surprised and said that he was 5 feet 90. Gerard replied that this was nonsense, as one who has undergone this training must be at least under 2 meters. He got angry and started asking the guy if he was doing the breathing exercises he taught him. Reifenhardt thought about it and remembered that the original Teflon was over 2 meters tall. He replied to Gerard that it probably depended on his body structure. Reifenhardt thought about how the old man had gone crazy, and he wasn't going to get any bigger. And if he uses this technique, his body will become monster-sized. Gerard told the boy that his body was still strong and powerful, even at that size. Then they came to the playground, and the teacher asked the boy to show all that he had learned. Reifenhardt concentrated his energy and rose upwards towards the sky, then used the tribulation horn technique. His fist was literally blazing with energy, and he flew downwards at an incredible speed. And using the 4th stage of the tribulation horn, everything around him glowed with bright blue energy. Such power shocked Gerard. He began to shout that it was magnificent. Gerard told his apprentice that with something like this, he wouldn't be able to be beaten so easily. At this time, Reifenhardt thought about the fact that he had finally succeeded in mastering the 4th stage. Gerard told the boy that it looked like the time for his coming out was approaching. Reifenhardt marveled at that. The teacher said he had done a good job. Gerard turned to a guy named Reifenhardt and said he could go. And he doesn't care if he takes the path of good or evil. He wants his apprentice to live the life he wants for himself, and said it was a reward for all the trials he had been through. Reifenhardt got excited and didn't expect this. Gerard told him that he was about to say some very important words. Master Raisdal had said those words to him 60 years ago. There are only 3 things to remember. It's okay to accumulate wealth, but it's important to do it in an honest way. Then young Gerard told his teacher that he had said he didn't mind if the student became a villain. Then Raisdal replied that if Gerard wanted that, he should be a decent villain and have his own special style. The second is to stand up for people who suffer injustice. To live better when you are praised, Gerard asked if the teacher meant not just the weak, but those who suffer injustice. The teacher replied that being weak does not mean that injustice has befallen. The world will be full of people weaker than him, and it will be impossible to distinguish one from the other. It is to make sure that the legacy of their martial art is never forgotten. Gerard told Reifenhardt that he needed to find an apprentice and pass on their teachings to him. Reifenhardt replied that he understood that. Gerard said that finding a worthy apprentice would not be an easy task, so it would be necessary to devote the rest of his life to it. But if luck smiled on him, he couldn't miss the chance. Then Gerard handed the boy some clothes and some money for future expenses. Reifenhardt was upset that he had only gotten 30 silver pieces. He told Gerard that he thought he had a fortune in the kingdom of Basil, and he could have given more. Gerard chuckled and said that their clan set the amount paid to apprentices at the end of training, and in his time it was about 25 silver. Gerard then pulled out a roll and said that he had stashed a small gift that Reifenhardt would find in the Setlard Mountains, and the place is marked on this map. Reifenhardt began to look at the map and thanked Gerard for everything. As he got ready to leave, he wondered if he was really ready to complete his training. He was glad to be free at last, but still the unknown did not give a clear assurance. No sooner had the guy stepped back a couple of meters than there was an incredible sound and power from the impact. Reifenhardt was frightened. It was Gerard who struck a blow and shouted for Reifenhardt to keep his way and not be sad about their parting. One must run and not look back, for Reifenhardt is now the heir to the greatest teaching in the world. In one of the settlements in the guest house, there was no way an elder could dare to approach a knight. He knew he had to say it, even though he was a nobleman. The old man approached the knight, and the knight asked him what the matter was. The elder replied that he demanded that they pay for the food, which he and his knights fed on to this day. The knight indignantly called them filthy villagers. The knight then threw 1 coin on the floor and said that this should be enough. The elder managed to catch that coin. Meanwhile, the knight thought that it must be the first time the old man had seen such a coin, that it was only a fraction of the amount needed. The knight became angry. He began to shout that the old man was quite insolent, and asked him if he thought he was ignorant of prices, if a nobleman. Then the knight struck the old man's face with his fist and said that no one dared to deceive him. The elder was thinking that they were not knights, but real bandits. They had taken their houses, their food, and paid a gold coin for everything. The elder hadn't even mentioned the cost of transportation and labor. Suddenly someone came up to the knight, calling him Sir Edward, and asked what was the matter. Edward sighed heavily and answered Mr. Stefan that it was nothing new. He smiled and called the villagers truly despicable people. Stefan also added that this is why we should not show mercy to the villagers. Otherwise they begin to forget their place. Meanwhile, Reifenhard was reminiscing about their time in bed with Cirrus. He asked her why she kept stroking him. Cirrus replied that she just felt like it. Reifenhard asked her what was so good about his skinny body. Cirrus smiled and replied that it looked sharp and neat. Reifenhard stood at the mirror and lamented how he used to look. Now he looked more like the last stone golem. Not to be completely frustrated, Reifenhard found the upside in the fact that he was now much taller. The boy continued to be sad and thought that Cirrus was now about 70 years old. Ours came out somewhere around 17. Reifenhard was now in the city of Krom in the south of the kingdom of Basel. He knew that Cirrus would be sold next year, so now she should be at the shot and slave auction. Reifenhard wondered what he should do. Should he just destroy the auction venue? But the guy realized that if he did something reckless, it would be difficult to regain magical powers, and it was better to settle everything with money. But the prices for elf slaves were astronomical, and Reifenhard was now broke. But the boy was not discouraged. He knew everything would be fine, and he would improve this powerful body and techniques with the knowledge of the future. Reifenhard thought that he had heard that there were ancient ruins on the way to Shadan. Knight Stefan asked Todd if he had figured out the exact location of the ancient ruins yet. Todd the mag archaeologist replied that it was worth waiting a little while and they would have the information. Stefan went to the window and Todd said that the ruins were in Death Valley. Stefan asked if that was the place. Todd replied that's right. It's where the famed swordsman Sir Claude von Leostar's Altion is buried. 3 days have passed since Reifenhard left the Krom. His way lies north to the Hatton Mountains on the main road. Reifenhard knew he had amazing stamina, but he hadn't realized that he wasn't afraid of the cold either. Artificial recall is an ancient secret technique that allows Reifenhard to regain his memory at any time. He used it to bring back memories of ancient ruins. Before the rollback, he had been chatting with the mage Todd he met in the magic tower of Delphia. He said he had been exploring the tomb of the Altyans. Reifenhard was there in a past life, too. He came across a real treasure that his crew had missed. He sold it all and got over 2,000 gold coins. Reifenhard had arrived at the village of Kettle. The boy noticed that she was the same. The villagers were discussing what they should do now. After all, the Valley of Death is a place not to be approached. One of the men began to shout that the nobles were demanding a guide, and everyone knew what would happen if they did not accept their offer. And an example of that was how they treated the elder. The guy got angry and started shouting that those damn nobles only thought of themselves. Suddenly a guy with a bow and arrow appeared and said he would go. The man was surprised that Ted had volunteered. Ted said that he knew the mountains better than anyone in the village, so he was the only suitable candidate. Suddenly his crying wife and daughter ran up to him, and the men in the crowd began to shout that Ted could definitely do it, and a man should keep his word. This made Ted hesitate in his decision. Suddenly, a huge face stuck to the window said he could go if Ted hesitated. Ted was frightened and pointed his bow towards the window. He asked who it was. Reifenhard replied that he was just passing by and had overheard the conversation. The villagers wondered how one could trespass on private property so casually. They began to ask Reifenhard if he was familiar with the neighborhood. Reifenhard replied that he had already been there. Ted asked if he knew that no one ever came back alive from Death Valley, and if he definitely wanted to go. Reifenhard smiled and replied that he had said it was nothing to him, and it wasn't his first time there. Remains of the Silver Age, a time long forgotten. There lived a knight of the Altion family whose name was Claude. At the young age of 45, he managed to awaken his aura in a multitude of adventures, and stories of his exploits spread throughout the kingdom of Basel. But fame breeds arrogance. Claude traveled to the Valley of Death with only one servant and died. The problem is that the demonic Altion sword he took with him got lost in there. The sword is a symbol of the Altion family that has been passed down from generation to generation, and the attempts to find him continued for over 50 years. In the meantime, Reifenhard went as an escort and spotted Stephen. He realized that this knight might be Claude's grandson. The elfess Lesia approached Stefan and began to say that he was so graceful even without a horse, as expected of a high knight. Reifenhard realized that she was an elf mercenary. Then he noticed that there was only one priest on their team, and Reifenhard wondered if he knew how to use holy spells. And he didn't look like a boy at all. Then Reifenhard noticed Todd and thought he should talk to him. But Todd and Celine were so engrossed in the conversation. Todd talked so much, even when they were younger. The atmosphere was stressing Reifenhard out a bit, and then he suddenly realized that Todd was a good guy now. Reifenhard couldn't believe it. Suddenly, a man approached Reifenhard and told him that he had made the right choice. Reifenhard replied that there was nothing wrong with showing the way. The man replied that it was so, but the inhabitants were still too frightened to undertake it. Then Reifenhard asked what could they be afraid of when they were accompanied by the brave knights of the kingdom? And at that moment Reifenhard was thinking how much those damn knights pissed him off. They're all too smug. Chivalry makes narcissists out of men. Suddenly at this moment, a strong wind appeared and the trees shook. Terrifying creatures started jumping down from the treetops. The commander shouted that it was an ambush and ordered everyone to fall into formation. The creatures began to attack. Stefan began screaming that how dare these vile monsters attack people blessed by Seer. Stefan ordered the Altai Knight order to go on the attack. Todd used the chain of fire technique. The creatures could not resist such fire, and Scylla joined in. He began to cast a spell, asking for strength and courage for the knights. Stefan fought in battle, and Reifenhard noticed that he was pretty good, and even better than Reifenhard expected. That's from a mage's perspective. If you evaluate their skills from a fighter's point of view, they are all nobodies. Reifenhard realized that Master Gerard was proud for a reason, and while everyone was engrossed in the battle, Reifenhard realized that no one was paying attention to him anyway. It was a good time to plug in. Reifenhard remembered that if Todd's story was true, that man Ted was supposed to be dead. Reifenhard realized that the expedition captain's name was Stefan, not to say he was a bad person, but he absolutely didn't care about the people around him. And then Reifenhard realized that Stefan was bad after all, and that's why the guy died then. Scylla approached Reifenhard and told him that it was dangerous here and he should hide behind the trees. Suddenly, the monster began to fire its wooden arrows at Reifenhard. Reifenhard was surprised, for these things did not even hurt him. But suddenly one of those arrows hit Reifenhard's eyes. He started screaming that he was in pain. And he was also surprised that he still had tears after the training he had endured. Stefan asked for a report on the wounded and asked if the mages and priests were all right. He was told that no one was hurt. Reifenhard was shocked and asked if they were not interested in their safety. However, no one even answered him. Stefan began to shout that this was what the strength of the knights of the Altion family meant. He ordered everyone to rest and enjoy the victory. Reifenhard realized that he needed to seize the moment and talk to Todd. He approached him and thanked him for their survival. Todd replied that it was no big deal. Then Reifenhard said that he had heard that Todd was from the magic tower of Delphia, and added that he had a friend there. Todd was surprised and asked who the friend was. Reifenhard said the friend's name was Reifenhard and asked if they knew each other. Todd replied that it was a surprise to him that the boy had such a friend, and he added that Reifenhard was quite nice and kind. Reifenhard stood there in shock. Todd asked him why he had asked about his friend. Reifenhard replied that he was just wondering how he was doing and if anything had happened lately. Todd replied that the boy spent day after day studying magic. Then Reifenhard asked if he was sure nothing strange had happened in the last few years. Todd replied that it was nothing like that. And the bridge of that boy's nose was still adorable, and his eyes were like gems, and his skin was incredibly smooth. Reifenhard realized that Todd was just like Gerard, only worried about appearance, albeit in a slightly different way. Reifenhard asked Todd that, for example, the boy's behavior hadn't changed in any way during that time. Todd replied that he wasn't sure, and he wasn't particularly interested in what he thought or did. Suddenly Scylla came up and asked Reifenhard if he was hurt. Reifenhard replied that he was fine, and it was better to take care of the orcs. Scylla did just that. He treated the orcs. The orcs did not expect such care and said that they were not hurt at all. Suddenly a man came up and told the priest that the orcs' wounds would heal even if they just licked them. He asked, why waste the strength of the wrong kind? Reifenhard has noticed that Scylla is kind and even treats them. But he treats them as if they were wounded dogs or cats, not as equals. The biggest problem with what is happening is the fundamental values of human beings. It will be impossible for other species to get equal rights for a very long time. Suddenly Stefan turned to Reifenhard and told him to move as they were on their way out. Reifenhard said that first they should go a little ahead, then to the right, and they should be prepared, for there would be a stream. Several hours passed, the knights discussing among themselves that there were many monsters in these mountains. A basilisk, a huge wolf, and about 20 ogres. Reifenhard laughed softly and answered himself that it was because he was leading them through the forest instead of on a normal road. Suddenly Stefan shouted for everyone to stop. Reifenhard knew that knights were arrogant, and priests were very stubborn, and mages were just plain mean. And he's a mage to the core. That's why he took the fastest route, so you can't blame him for lying. And Reifenhard did it, of course, despite them. Stefan was already walking with his last strength, and said that this was the place that had become Sir Claude's grave. It was no wonder, for there were so many monsters in these mountains. At last, Stefan climbed to the top and came to the cliff. In front of him, he saw a breathtaking view. In the very ruins. With the whole team, they began to climb down and came to the ancient ruins of Plato. The view was simply mesmerizing. They walked up to the main entrance, and the doors opened. Todd pointed to the entrance and said that he thought it was safe. Stefan ordered everyone to get ready. Reifenhard said that he would wait for them here. Stefan replied that his work was done. Reifenhard replied that he did not think he could reach the village alone. Then Stephen said that for his help in the expedition they would protect him on the way back. Reifenhard couldn't wait until they were already inside. Stefan began to shout that greatness and glory awaited them inside. He ordered his team to find the demonic sword Altion. Reifenhard watched from the sidelines and wished them success. Everyone went inside, and now Reifenhard said it was time to do what he had come here to do. The ruins are just crawling with monsters and ghosts. But before, during the Silver Age, it was a logistical center and military installation. Even if it were an ordinary building, the technology of that era is comparable to a miracle, so it's insanely valuable. It had been a long time, the last time Reifenhard explored this place with Cirrus. Cirrus had said they could hear the sylphs whispering here, which means there's a secret passage. Reifenhard called her a goddess for doing such a good job. Cirrus said she was embarrassed to hear Reifenhard say that. Then he pulled her against him and said he would reward her with a kiss. Reifenhard remembered that what they were doing with Cirrus in the middle of those insanely dangerous ruins. He recalled that there seems to be a cipher used here, based on the balance shifting to the left and the aqua and terra symbols combined in reverse order. Reifenhard already knows the answer anyway. Now it is not so simple, for the body lacks mana. Its underdevelopment in magic is depressing. Reifenhard decided to leave his clothes at the entrance. You can't just throw away things that tin silver had been spent on. Reifenhard realized that it was time to test this body's physical abilities. Reifenhard heard screams. He couldn't understand what was happening. The team had gone in a different direction. Why were the screams coming from this direction? Reifenhard realized that the secret passage connected the surface and the third floor of the dungeon. And if it were opened, it would be an emergency. Reifenhard remembered that this was a military installation, and saturating its systems with mana would activate all the defenses that would have to wipe out the invaders. The two of them and Cirrus had explored the ruins together, so there was nothing to worry about. But right now, there was a group of knights inside who had apparently fallen into a trap and fallen to the second floor. Reifenhard screwed up. Meanwhile, the knights were caught in a real trap. Stefan was trying to save the knights, and suddenly he saw before him a creature that they would definitely not be able to defeat. He wondered, how could a human even deal with something like that? Scylla was treating the knights with healing light. The knights thanked the priest, and Scylla thought about the fact that he couldn't survive without them. In fact, he had almost glued his flippers together when the floor collapsed and they flew downward. Scylla thanked Todd that his protective magic had saved them. Todd replied that they had survived the fall, but it was not yet known if they would make it out unharmed. Suddenly, a monster of huge size appeared. Everyone started running in different directions. No one had ever seen anything like it before. Scylla began to cast a spell for the great Philanins to bring his mace of righteous light down upon this wicked creature. A magical light restrained the monster. Scylla began to cast a spell to give these men unwavering courage. Scylla was shocked that these knights called themselves brave, as if they had built up their muscles for nothing. The priest began to cast the spell again and asked for more unwavering courage to be given to these men. Todd watched from the sidelines and wondered how much divine power Scylla had poured into them that they had become berserk. The knights gathered and decided to show this thing their courage. Todd plugged in and began to cast a spell to let the earth open its arms and take what came out of it. Nothing could stop this monster, and even the mercenary elf was powerless before him. An injured Lelsia dropped to the floor and asked Stefan if she had been helpful. Stefan replied that it had been a good job. Stefan fought the monster with dignity, as expected of a young lord. He ordered everyone to group together and began shouting that the great knight Claude had been defeated here. There was a loud and fiery explosion. The monster began to glow with bright orange fire. Fire blazed from his mouth and his entire body. The knights could barely hold their defenses. Stefan ordered no one to hesitate, since their fate was sealed when they joined the squad. The day they called themselves the Knights of No Speech could no longer restrain the knights. They fled in different directions out of fear. Stefan could not accept this. He did not want to die like this. He grabbed his sword and started yelling that he couldn't lose. Stefan pounced on the monster. Fury and anger swept over him. He began to shout that he bore the name of Altion, the one who had been dubbed resolute. He used a stabbing lunge technique. However, he couldn't hold on for long. The monster struck a blow that sent Stefan tumbling downward. The exhausted Stefan fell to the ground. Scylla began to cast a spell to destroy the wicked creature with his light. The divine light began to strike the monster. However, it only lasted for a few seconds, and the monster began to blaze with its bright fire again, was powerless against the creature, and was thrown back several meters. Scylla saw a huge, strong body in front of him. Reifenhard used his technique, and his aura shone with a bright light. Reifenhard gathered all his strength and struck a sharp blow. The monster immediately fell to the ground. Reifenhard didn't even realize why he had died so quickly. Scylla and Reifenhard stood in shock. The boy realized that it was no surprise that Teslan had almost killed him. Reifenhard turned around and saw the wounded team lying on the ground. He said he needed to carry the men to safety. The revitalized skeletons began to run at Reifenhard as he carried the Elphus in his arms. However, he scattered them all with a flick of his hand. Todd and Scylla stood there in complete shock. They couldn't understand who this guy was, or how he had managed to do it. After a while, Stefan came to his senses. He was shocked to see skeletons killed around him, and was told that Reifenhard destroyed the monster and the other monsters too. When Stefan heard that, he almost went crazy. He clarified that the man was a martial artist. Then Stefan approached Reifenhard, and he said it was his mistake for not recognizing him as someone so revered. Stephen asked him his name. Reifenhard hesitated, for he knows that Todd knows the Reifenhard who lives in the tower. So he said his name was Reifen. The knight was surprised to hear such a name and thought that if Reifen were so strong, he would definitely know him. Stefan asked to which clan Reifen belonged. The boy answered that he was of none. Stefan immediately thought that he was a pathetic commoner. He thought that Reifenhard was a noble wanderer in search of knowledge, but this was a commoner. Stefan replied to Reifenhard that considering his unassuming appearance, he had done a good job dealing with the remnants of his enemies, and he could accept that well-deserved praise. Reifenhard brushed Stefan's hand off his shoulder and wondered how he'd even come to such an inference. After all, they were literally helpless. Stefan was surprised at such insolence and asked how dare he behave like that. And respect for the All-Tyon clan must be shown. The knight tried to calm Stefan and said that he was a commoner and had no way of knowing about etiquette. The knight tried to reassure Stefan and said that he was a commoner and had no way of knowing etiquette. Then Stephen asked Reifenhard to tell him who had trained him. The boy replied that he had studied here and there. Reifenhard knew that Master Gerard was known all over the world, and it was not a good idea to tell everyone about him. Let his adventures be a mystery for now. Stefan replied that his ability level was quite high. Reifenhard said that he should take care of the wounded. The knight wondered if this guy's manner of speaking seemed so casual. Reifenhard pointed his finger at the crowd of wounded soldiers and asked if they needed help. Watching this, the knight also realized that Reifenhard didn't seem to quite understand that his words were full of arrogance. This manner of communication is peculiar only to high-ranking people addressing their subordinates. And age aside, he either doesn't care at all about rank and titles. Either that or he's a high-ranking person from overseas. But there's something special about his tone. He speaks as if he is much older than the people he is addressing. Scylla approached the guy and apologized, saying that I think his name was Reifen. He asked how tall Reifenhard was. Reifenhard replied that he was about 5 feet 2. The surprised Scylla asked how much he weighed. Reifenhard replied that he did not know. He had not weighed himself. Scylla then asked him how he managed to get such a body by training. Reifenhard replied that he was beaten, and that he also ate a lot and carried heavy weights. Then Scylla said that he knew it, and that there are rumors that martial arts masters don't reveal the secret of their training. Who lost his parents at an early age and was raised in an orphanage, was often teased because of his appearance. Maybe that's where the desire to change sprouted from. Strong body and low, loud voice. He wanted to be a monk, demonstrating his piety through body hardening. But life had its own plans for him. Puberty hadn't started, and for some reason his hair was growing incredibly fast. Strength training had tested him time and time again. Only his magical abilities improved due to the constant treatment of his wounds. For this reason, he began to look at muscular people. Reifenhard couldn't understand what was wrong with this Scylla. He said he would go on a reconnaissance mission. Scylla said he would go with him. What if someone needed the priest's help? Suddenly Stefan said that in that case he would go. Lelsia would stay and look after everyone. Stefan then asked if Reifenhard was okay with it. The boy answered that he didn't care. On the way, Stefan thought about the fact that even if everything coincided like that, he had to thank this commoner for his help. And he must be proud of himself now. His gait literally screams arrogance and disrespect for knights. Stefan thought he was an arrogant bastard. He couldn't wait to see Reifenhard speak when the demon showed up. Stefan would demonstrate his powers and put him in his place. Stefan was glad there were demons at every turn. Suddenly Reifenhard knocked him out with a palm on the back of his neck, telling him they were almost there and he'd better get some sleep. The monsters started running at Reifenhardt. The guy used one of his techniques and knocked them out as well. Now that Reifenhardt had dealt with all the obstacles, he decided to take a look at the prey. Reifenhardt entered the secret passageway and found 50 pieces of silver from those times. But he was looking for something else, and finally he found it. A bottomless bag is a magical device that allows you to store items by reducing their volume tenfold. The weight of the item decreases in proportion to its volume. Reifenhardt remembered that there should be a few other valuable items lying here. There's the heavenly roaster, the returning dagger, and the magic sapphire. It's full to the brim with jewels. Stefan had come to his senses and couldn't understand what had happened. Reifenhardt told him that he was finally awake, and that he had been kicked in the back of the head by the monsters. Stefan couldn't understand why he was having such bad luck today. He thanked Reifenhardt for his help. In the end, to completely clean the ruins, Reifenhardt had to repeat the procedure 3 more times. He was even worried that Stefan would become insane. And even if he did, he still had a good life ahead of him, so Reifenhardt didn't care. When he woke up again, Steph thought it was strange, as he was extremely alert, but he still didn't notice the impact. Reifenhardt filled his bag and had decided it was time to go back. Reifenhardt told Stefan that it looked like they had scouted most of the terrain, and they could head back. Stefan agreed, and they went back for the team. Silen kept up with Reifenhardt. He asked him that maybe he was of noble descent. The boy replied that he was a commoner. Silen was surprised and said that with such capabilities it was amazing. Then Reifenhardt asked if it was so strange. Silen replied that it's all about how Reifen talks to people. And he also added that he understood that being a martial arts master, one could talk to Stefan like that. But Silen hadn't expected Reifenhardt to talk like that to Sir Edward, who was in his 40s. And then Reifenhardt realized that he was really only 22 now, and needed to be more discreet. He wasn't used to dealing with people, so the etiquette was a little lame. The team continued walking forward as they all suddenly came to an abrupt halt. The monstrous Grell appeared in front of them. Reifenhardt wondered and couldn't understand where this monster had come from. After all, there had been nothing like it last time. Stefan had already pulled out his sword and said, so that's what kind of demon was standing guard over this place. It became clear to Reifenhardt that he had not yet been killed in this world. Reifenhardt suggested that Stefan go back, as they would not be able to defeat the monster. Suddenly, one of the knights told Stefan to pay attention to the sword in the clutches of this demon. Stefan saw the sword of Altion in front of him. Edward began to ask Stefan if he really wanted to fight a demon. Stefan replied that it was obvious. Edward said it was too dangerous, and they needed to go back and report everything to the family, then come back here prepared. Stephen replied that he was talking utter nonsense, and could it not be seen that this creature was desecrating the sword of the great king? Stefan's only thought was that there was no turning back, and he would get the sword back at any cost, even if he had to fight to the death. He ordered all the knights to raise their blades. Reifenhardt watched from the sidelines and thought how stupid this was. At the intersection of dimensions in the ruins of the Silver Age, the system is designed to automatically compensate for its weaknesses. But because it was disabled, these creatures fell victim to the defense mechanisms. In other words, the so-called dungeon guardians. They lived freely until they were kidnapped. In addition, a monster fused with the mechanisms of the ruins is a far more formidable opponent. Reifenhardt knew from rumors that this monster had killed Sir Claude, who knew how to use aura. If a demon of a higher rank than a Tagrel becomes a dungeon guardian, it probably uses the powers of other dimensions. Stefan started yelling that the monster was chained. And are they really so cowardly that they can't go out against such an opponent? Reifenhardt told Edward that was Stefan really going to fight him, since they don't stand a chance. Edward replied that he was grateful for Reifenhardt's help, but he was only a savage who knew nothing of honor. And there are things in the world worth risking your life for. Reifenhardt said that the enemy was beyond them, and they couldn't handle a Tagrel. How do they plan to deal with this thing? Silen began to recite his spell and ask for a blessing to be bestowed upon them, and for the demon to leave. As soon as the knights approached the monster, it immediately started destroying them one by one. Reifenhardt sighed and said he told you it wouldn't work. And now the knights would fly like stars in the sky. Reifenhardt knew the demon would beat the crap out of them now. Stefan didn't give up, shouting that they were knights of Altion, and any demon would bow to them. Reifenhardt thought he was slowly beginning to understand this guy. No matter how much he was told, he wouldn't give up what he had. But at least Sir Edward has more rational thoughts about what's going on, while as for Stefan, he's still holding his own against the creature. He flies like a butterfly and stings like a bee. But to be fair, it only made a couple of scratches. Read the spell to bring his mace of righteous light down upon this unholy creature. Scylla then began to ask Philinids to bring down this mace with all her might. Lelsia had climbed the monster right on its horns. Stefan praised her for doing such a good job. Reifenhard watched from the sidelines and thought that this girl Lelsia was quite capable, even better than Sir Edward. She would be second in the group in terms of strength. Reifenhard wondered if maybe he had underestimated them. Meanwhile, Todd was casting a spell to make the chill of the north wind linger in his hand and turn into a whirlwind. A huge wind vortex formed. Suddenly, a notification sounded that the defense system was being rebooted. Going into Phase 2, Reifenhard became visibly nervous. He realized that this thing was not going to play with anyone now. The monster was angry, and Stefan got closer to it and swung to strike. The demon struck back. Stefan was thrown back and hit the wall. Edward ran to the rescue, glad that Stefan was still alive. The demon unleashed a wave of fire that destroyed almost everyone. Scylla was right in the line of fire, and he realized that he could not escape. Suddenly he saw Reifenhard in front of him. Reifenhard applied the technique and the fire went around them. Reifenhard then apologized to Scylla and said that he was a little out of it and thinking slowly. Reifenhard found himself right in front of the demon. He wasn't sure if he had the strength to fight such an opponent, but to be honest, he was still curious to know the limit of his abilities. Was it possible to defeat him with martial arts? Reifenhard had never had to play such games with fate, but now he was no longer a mage. Now one must fight strong enemies. These are feelings Reifenhard has never experienced. He noticed that it looked like the martial arts were starting to take over in him. Gerard would have been glad to see that. Gerard had always said that if in doubt, you should do it. So Reifenhard struck his first blow at the demon. The demon stood and drew his sword. Reifenhard managed to dodge. The guy knew his body could withstand a steel sword, but it was still best to stay away from the demonic one. The battle continued, the demon not letting up for a second. Reifenhard held his ground, too. Suddenly, the demon struck Reifenhard with its hind hoof right in his chest, and he was thrown backwards. Scylla was frightened and started screaming to see if he was all right. Reifenhard rose quickly and said he was fine. Scylla was shocked. He wondered if that was the power of the aura user. Reifenhard realized that if he just stood still, he would have the opportunity for a counterattack. But after all the beatings from the master, blocking blows had become a habit, and there's probably no better chance to practice the technique. The demon was even more angry that Reifenhard had risen, so was about to attack. Stefan watched from the sidelines. Stefan noticed Reifenhard's aura. He couldn't understand how a commoner could use an aura that even he, the noblest of nobles. Cold sweat covered Stefan's face with each blow from Reifenhard. Stefan started yelling loudly, "Who the hell is this guy, and where did he come from?" Meanwhile, Reifenhard had cornered the demon and was about to deliver a bright. The more Reifenhard fought the demon, the more he realized just how incredible its abilities were. He could see its attacks with ease. Dungeon guardians are not easy to defeat, even if they are badly wounded. The ruins healed him with mana. The demon was blasting fire at Reifenhard, but the guy sprawled and jumped at him, grabbing the demon's arm. He decided to practice breaking the joint, and then the aerial combat, and the punching technique. Reifenhard noticed that the demon was the perfect punching bag. The knight stood still and watched this battle in shock. No one could believe that this guy could do such a thing. Reifenhard thought he'd had enough of fooling around. If he wanted to end it all in one blow, he'd have to use the Horn of Distress. But also Reifenhard realized that if he did, the whole dungeon would collapse on their heads. And he had a lot of things with him that needed to be taken away. Todd shouted to Reifenhard to use the sword, and if he covered the sword with aura and used the priest's magic, the monster could be defeated. Reifenhard wondered who he was so clever at. He replied that he didn't know how to cover weapons with aura. Todd was surprised and asked how that was possible. Reifenhard replied that he could only open the body with his aura, and that was the way the people of their clan were. Suddenly, Scylla started shouting to Reifenhard. The boy asked what more he wanted from him. Scylla replied that his body was very strong. Reifenhard replied that yes, it's pretty strong. Scylla then said that he was now using the blessing of philanthropy. Scylla began to cast a spell to allow his blessing to imbue the blade with power. Reifenhard's body began to glow. The Reifenhard grabbed the demon by its front paws and, lifting it above him, threw it sharply and powerfully to the ground. After such a powerful blow, the demon couldn't even get up. Reifenhard thought, "What a disgusting spell. It's so strong. It chills me to the bone." He also wondered how Scylla had gotten the idea to use a spell meant for metal blades on a human. Scylla was beginning to be glad that his idea had worked. He shouted to Reifenhard to give the demon a good thrashing. Reifenhard had not expected this, for Scylla did not match his cute appearance at all. Reifenhard himself wanted to get it over with. Gathering his strength, Reifenhard used a divine kick and then a divine knee, and finally the final divine blow with all the power. The demon simply had no chance of life after such a blow. Sillin was glad that it was over. Reifenhard didn't hide his emotions either and asked him to break the spell. The demon was gone. The wounded team headed for the exit. Suddenly, Stefan stopped Reifenhard. He told Reifenhard that he had hidden his real power to the last, and asked if he had laughed enough. And Stefan also said that he sees that Reifenhard has strength, but he can't forget the fact that Reifenhard trampled on his knightly honor. He asked again if Reifenhard had fun watching the battle and taunting them. Reifenhard replied that it was nothing like that. Reifenhard thought that it was possible to mock when one was even slightly interested in what was going on. But what had happened here? He wasn't the least bit interested. Reifenhard turned around and walked on. Suddenly Stefan drew his sword and shouted that how dare Reifen turn his back on him. Stefan came at Reifenhard from behind and was about to strike with his sword. Reifenhard bent down to pick up Alshin's sword from the ground. Stefan fell past, and Reifenhard raised his sword. He was even a little amused by the awkward situation. Stefan got angry and called Reifenhard a creature, asking how dare he dodge. Reifenhard held out his sword to Stefan and said that he wasn't going to mock anyone. He asked if that was why they had come here. Edward had said that not having the slightest shadow of greed when holding something valuable was where the real power was. Stefan found himself in an awkward situation. Reifenhard at this time was thinking that what greed was even talked about if this was just a second-rate weapon when compared to what he had created in his past life. Stefan said it was time to head back as there was nothing left to see here. The team arrived at the village of Kettle. Sillin used a spell to cure the infant's ailment. Reifenhard watched this and marveled that Sillin had first healed the sick and was now giving them gold. Reifenhard realized that he certainly knew how to do business, and given the Finnen's order's ultimate acquisitions, it's fair to say that the money wasn't wasted. The team saddled their horses. On the way, Stefan turned to Edward and said that he thought they should find out more about this Reifen. Edward replied that he knew Reifen would be interested in him. Stefan was tormented by the thought that there was no way he could be weaker than this Reifen. Reifenhard meanwhile went on his way. All he could think about now was that it was time to meet Cirrus. Reifenhard asked him why he was coming with him. Sillin replied that there are traveling priests who show the favor of the gods and care for the faithful. Reifenhard said that they are called pilgrims. And also Reifenhard did not say that they often die on their journeys. Sillin said he had planned to return to the order, but decided to take the opportunity to become a pilgrim. And also, if possible, wander with the strongest of the people he meets along the way. Reifenhard got angry and thought his look was just like Gerard and Todd's. Did he, too, only care about appearances? Reifenhard didn't understand if he was cursed, and why there were always people around who thought along similar lines. He figured Sillin seemed like a nice guy, so if he asked him nicely, maybe he'd back off. And then Reifenhard had an epiphany. Sillin is a priest, so he's a medicine man, and Cirrus might be injured, so it would be useful to have someone like that with him. So Reifenhard took a deep breath and told Sillin that traveling with them or not was his personal choice. Reifenhard's thoughts were all about Cirrus. Sillin had been asking him all the way to tell him how he was training his muscles, because he wanted to build them up. Reifenhard replied that he had already said that he had been beaten and carried weights. Sillin then said that alchemists had invented a new remedy for such things, and it was called protein. Reifenhard replied that he didn't care. The subordinate bowed to his master Beret and said that he had done his best, but this elf girl was naughty. An heir to the Karen trade organization named Beret replied that elves must be obedient and present both body and mind to their master. Beret got angry and started yelling that he knew she was so cheap for a reason. He asked why the elf was so arrogant. The elf replied that she was born that way. Bereth couldn't hold back his anger. He said he was pissed off by her annoying stare. The elven girl replied again that she was born with those eyes. Then Beret lost his temper and told the butler that he didn't care how much she cost, but he needed to buy a normal elf girl, and this one at that price could be considered defective. In the Principality of Caton, in the slave market called Elfheim, elf girl number 148 was returned to the seller for the third time. The Principality of Caton is a trading nation located in the north of the continent. It borders other principalities. The Huron River flows through it, providing a continuous increase in trade. Reifenhard and Sillin arrived in Zeppelin, the capital of the state and the center of all trade. Sillin said it was as crowded as expected from the center of all commerce. Reifenhard replied that this state was founded by merchants who had bought the lands from the kingdom of Graham, and the salesmen here have great privileges, and the people here only think about money. And most importantly, he knew this was where he'd find Cirrus. Sillin asked him to slow down a bit, or he wouldn't be able to run fast enough. Suddenly, Reifenhard saw a picture of a commoner asking for mercy. The consortium head named Tarek shouted that how dare a dirty beggar insult the Ralfine Trade Consortium. Tarek began beating the man and shouting that he would teach that filthy ragamuffin a lesson. He then threw a pile of gold coins at the man and said that 30 gold for the appropriate number of blows should be enough. Reifenhard couldn't understand what was going on. Sillen approached the man and asked if he was all right. The man replied that he was fine. Sillen began shouting that this horrible man should be reported to the authorities. The man smiled, started picking up coins from the ground, and said that there was no need for that, and that the money should be enough for him to settle here. Sillen was shocked and asked if he was willing to turn a blind eye to such things because of a couple of coins. Reifenhard said that he had told him that the local people had only money on their minds. It seemed hard to surprise Sillen anymore after so much wandering. But this was his first time in a place like this. Reifenhard said that in any case the punishment here is nothing. You can't go to jail here if you have the right amount. Sillen asked Reifenhard why they had come here. The boy replied, to buy. Sillen was surprised and asked what exactly to buy. Reifenhard smiled and replied that he wanted to buy the Elphus. Hearing this, Sillen was simply shocked. He said that this is what Reifenhard's true nature is. But Reifenhard replied that he understood his train of thought, but it was not like that at all. Sillen then asked what then? Reifenhard realized he couldn't tell about his past life, so he said it was his nature. Sillen replied that all men are so vile. Reifenhard laughed and said that he was one of them too. An elven maid brought Tarek news that their consortium was said to be harassing the common traders. Tarek replied that they would be better off working instead of throwing around accusations. Chatter doesn't make money. The Elphus bowed and replied that he was right. Beret entered unexpectedly. Tarek was very happy to see him. He asked Beret what had happened to the elf he had recently bought for himself. He should have stumbled upon that particular one. He told Tarek that she'd been naughty, so he'd brought her back 2 weeks ago. Tarek laughed loudly and said that he couldn't even tame an elven slave girl. No wonder his organization didn't even make the top 10. Beret then asked how he himself thought he could tame her. After all, she had been returned several times already without considering him, so the low price was justified. Tarek, meanwhile, was wondering what Beret's face would be like if he succeeded in taming the Elphus. So he decided to go to Elfheim. Sillen was actively practicing strength exercises. Seeing this, Reifenhard asked what he was doing. Sillen replied that he was practicing. Reifenhard told him not to overdo it, as they couldn't lose him over some nonsense. Sillen replied that it was fine, and he was already done. Then Sillen cast a spell and his fatigue was gone. Reifenhard was shocked, and now it's all falling into place. The magic of healing is somewhat similar to time management. Muscles are trained by stretching and natural healing. But if he uses healing magic, he's right back where he started. Reifenhard realized that Sillen the Fool was just wasting time. Sillen asked what happened and what Reifenhard was thinking about. The boy replied that he would teach him a more effective training sometime later. Reifenhard asked if it was convenient to train with such long hair. Sillen replied that it grows back quickly. Then Reifenhard said he had enough money, so it was time for him to go to the auction. Sillen shouted that he would go with him. You can find all sorts of slaves at the auction. The most popular are the elves. They are much more expensive than orcs or dwarves, all because of their beauty. Elf warrior 800 zlotys, young elf 100 zlotys, young elf 30 zlotys, orc swordsman 10 zlotys, orc worker 5 zlotys, orc child 4 zlotys. Another reason for this high price is their lifespan. But this also means that they also take much longer to mature. And there is a silly joke that a foolish buyer will die of old age if he buys a young elf. Sillen told Reifenhard that Elfheim has specialized in selling elves for over 300 years. Reifenhard knew of this place being called an elf's paradise, and it made him sick. Sillen, meanwhile, said that he had never been to a place like this, and he also added that elves were probably treated better than orcs. Reifenhard replied that they were still slaves, and did he really think they were happy? Sillen replied that they were used to living in the wild. And isn't it better to be under the care of people who take away their worries about hunger? Reifenhard knew that this was the overwhelming opinion. Force would not change people's minds. It would only bring fear into their hearts. Reifenhard realized that he would have to establish a new empire, different from the one he had created in his past life. Not the dark empire of a demon king, but a state without racial oppression. Suddenly, the butler appeared and apologized for the wait. He said they had the finest warrior women of Elfheim before them. The butler looked at Sillen and said it would be too much for the young lady. Sillen closed his eyes and Reifenhard replied that it was fine. Reifenhard asked if there were any warriors with darker skin. The butler smiled and replied that it was a rather unusual taste, and asked Reifenhard that didn't he like pale people. The lad replied that he did not mean that. Then the butler said they had one dark-skinned elf warrior and said he would show her off now. The butler asked to follow him, and Reifenhard and Scylla followed him. The butler led them to the fountain where the elven girls were practicing. The butler said they make sure the elves keep themselves in shape, and they have a special method to make sure everyone finds the right person. The butler began to tell me that their diet necessarily includes fresh fruits, vegetables, and nuts. Elves eating quality food have an extremely pleasant flavor. Here Reifenhard couldn't contain his anger any longer and said that enough explanations were enough, and he just wanted to be escorted to this elven woman. The butler gave him a scornful look, and finally they came to a gate with guards. He told the guards that they needed to see number 148. A multitude of elven women were practicing with swords. The butler said that these elven girls were candidates who could hardly be called warriors, and here they were practicing. Then the butler pointed to the girl over there and said she was the one he wanted. Suddenly tears came from Reifenhard's eyes. He couldn't believe he was seeing his own beloved Cirrus in front of him. A memory from the past came over Reifenhard. Cirrus had told him not to mix the two ingredients. Reifenhard wondered and asked why, and then immediately mixed them together, and there was an explosion. Reifenhard asked why it suddenly exploded. Cirrus replied that because you can't mix fireweed extract with earthseed. Reifenhard apologized and said that he thought he would definitely get a breakthrough now. Cirrus laughed and said that he had said the same thing yesterday, and it had ended the same way. Then Cirrus wiped the dust from his cheeks and wondered why Reifenhard was so cute for his age. Reifenhard asked her how much longer she planned to call him by his title, but she could use it plainly. Cirrus lowered her eyes. Reifenhard asked why. The girl looked embarrassed. The very day the Reifenhard Empire was attacked, he looked out at the blazing Antares. Reifenhard's closest friends came to his aid. The orc bowed and said he was here to pay his last respects to his lord. Reifenhard turned to Attica, McHelen, and Cirrus. He asked what was wrong with their faces. It was as if they were seeing someone on their deathbed for the first time. Over 2 million soldiers from all over the continent showed up for Reifenhard's head. He said there was probably nothing more for mankind to do. Reifenhard said he wondered what would happen afterward. Will they destroy each other's countries in a brutal, bloody battle? The orc replied that it only simply meant that they could not accept the fact that they existed. He asked Reifenhard if he would go with them. Reifenhard replied that only they had a chance of escape, and he would still fall behind. He apologized to Alpot for being unable to keep his promise. Alpot replied that it was not a promise, but a prophecy. Reifenhard said that it was the same thing anyway. Alpot's prophecy said to stay close to the elf when the orc was pointing the way. Then they would find the man who would pass through the abyss of Daimon and destroy Hawkril's pillar. One must follow him, and he will give them salvation and change their lives for the better. Reifenhard said that at that moment it surprised him a lot, because the dwarves had nicknamed him Savior when he had destroyed half of the sanctuary. And Reifenhard puzzled over the situation for a long time. All the close friends told the Lord that they hoped they would meet again. Reifenhard replied that he hoped they would survive the day. Reifenhard then turned to Cirrus and said that she should leave as well. Cirrus replied that she would wait for him. Reifenhard replied that fate was unpredictable, and if something happened to him, he hoped she would find someone good. Cirrus again said that she would wait for him. Reifenhard again tried to explain to her that the situation was very tense. But Cirrus started shouting that she would wait. Their gazes collided and Reifenhard couldn't resist. He pulled Cirrus against him. So in the present tense, the butler told Reifenhard that, frankly, he wouldn't want to show it to customers, because she is defective and completely untrained. And she was recently returned for the 3rd time. No one even looks at her abilities, because her terrible character negates all the advantages. She's such a hard sell that she's become a training doll for others. After all, if you want to be a real warrior, you have to know what it's like to cut real flesh. The butler asked Reifenhard if he still wanted to buy it. Reifenhard replied menacingly, yes. The butler thought that Reifenhard seemed to have rather peculiar tastes, and might be able to shake a few extra coins out of him. He said it was worth 300 zlotys. Scylla was surprised, and said it was really cheap, only 300. The butler said it was completely worthless, and he wasn't even sure it was worth selling. Cirrus appeared in front of Reifenhard and asked if he was now her new master. Reifenhard looked at her and wondered how much she had been through since she had such scars on her body. The butler asked if he should get a priest to take care of her wounds. Reifenhard replied that it was fine, and he had Scylla for that. Then he gave his clothes to Cirrus and said it was cold outside, so they should put this on, and then they'd get her some stuff. Reifenhard clarified with her that she didn't have a name yet. The girl replied that she didn't have one yet. Then Reifenhard asked, what about Cirrus? The girl replied that she understood. Reifenhard asked if she liked the name. The girl replied that her name was Cirrus, and it was easy to remember. Then Reifenhard looked at her and said that her name was now Cirrus Valencia. Cirrus replied that a slave doesn't need a last name, and she is the master. Reifenhard replied that it was now her last name. He then introduced himself and said the guy next to him is Silen. He's a priest of Philinets. Cirrus replied that she understood. Meanwhile, the butler was questioned about room 148, and he said that it had already been sold. Tarek stood there in complete shock. He was angry. And the butler informed him that she had been bought just an hour ago. Tarek asked if Beret had gotten wind of his plan and bought her back, but the butler replied that the buyer was an unknown young man. Tarek asked what his name was. The butler replied that he had paid for everything. Tarek then asked if there was anyone wandering around with enough money to ransom the elf warrior. The butler replied that he had sold her at an undervalued price because she was unsuitable for the role of a warrior. Tarek told him to tell him what the man looked like. The butler said that he was a young man of sturdy build and hard to miss. Meanwhile, Reifenhard had dressed Cirrus in new clothes. Reifenhard appraised the outfit and said it would do for the time being, and he would buy something better later. Cirrus and Silen set off. Reifenhard asked if Cirrus was hungry. The girl answered as her master would say. Then Reifenhard flared up and said that it was enough to think of him as a master. Then Cirrus asked if he was already going to take her back. Reifenhard replied that he didn't mean that. Cirrus couldn't understand what was wrong with this guy. First giving her his clothes, then buying her new ones, and treating her like she was a human girl. Reifenhard added that he just wanted to say that it would be nice if she considered him a comrade. So he asked if she could call him by his first name instead of just master. Cirrus didn't know what to think. She assumed it was some kind of role-playing game. And he's the kind of pervert who pretends to be a traveler, and he probably wants to play the hero traveling with the swordswoman. Cirrus replied that in that case she would call him Sir Reifenhard. Reifenhard brought Cirrus something to eat. The girl gorged herself on the food, but she thought that people were all the same. Reifenhard said that Redante's Grace is considered the most famous restaurant in the capital, and they named it after Redante, the goddess of fertility. Silen asked then why isn't their food free? Reifenhard then asked that doesn't the religion of philanthropy get money from the beauty industry? Silen replied that this was self-evident, for she was the goddess of love and beauty, so it was in no way contrary to their dogma. Reifenhard said that he had heard that they were making a lot of profit from it. Silen replied that this was true, but that was the end of his argument. Reifenhard looked at Cirrus carefully and couldn't tell if she liked it or not. After all, in a previous life they had come here for the anniversary of their acquaintance. Then Reifenhard was her savior. Now he was the one who had ransomed her from slavery. It is not so much the fact of the meeting that matters, but the circumstances under which it took place. Reifenhard wondered if they had met too soon, but he hoped that sooner or later he would be able to make contact with her, and he was fine with that. Walking through the market, they came to a tent with weapons. The seller assured them that he had the best goods. Reifenhard asked Cirrus if she had chosen something for herself. Cirrus took the rapier. Reifenhard was surprised and asked if a saber wouldn't be more familiar. Cirrus couldn't understand how he knew. Silen had said that it was true what they say, after all, that a martial artist need only look at a man's hands to determine the weapon he was using. Silen picked up a few things for himself as well. He never thought he would have the mithril weapon he wanted so badly before. Reifenhard was surprised and asked why the priest needed a weapon. Silen answered nothing and simply walked on. Suddenly Reifenhard noticed that they were being watched. Soon a group of soldiers approached them, and one of them said that they would like to discuss a matter with them. Reifenhard asked what the matter was. The military man gave him a menacing look and replied that a nobleman wanted to ransom his Elphus. Reifenhard gave him a scornful look and replied that he didn't care. The man said that if Reifenhard would sell it, they would be willing to pay a considerable sum. The military man then held out an envelope and said that if Reifenhard wished, they could offer a skilled warrior in return, and here was the document for review. Reifenhard replied that he was not interested. The military officer then asked if that could be considered a waiver. Reifenhard replied yes. The military man then said that Reifenhard may not have heard that they were offering a lot of money for her. Reifenhard angrily replied to the military man that he probably didn't hear, since Reifenhard had already said he wasn't interested. Then the military man replied that this was an unusual case and they had no other choice. Since Reifenhard was so attached to this elf woman, the military man left, and Reifenhard asked what that was about. Silen said that the guy seemed funny to him. The military returned to Tarek, and he began yelling loudly at the commander-in-chief for coming without the Elphus. Commander-in-chief Romad replied that the guy refused to sell it for any money, and that his worldview was somewhat naive. Tarek said he could have just beaten him, and then thrown a couple coins in his face. Romad replied that they were surrounded by a crowd, so etiquette had to be observed. Romad then said that he was now devising a plan to kidnap the Elphys, and then they would say she was dead, and they would offer a price twice the market price. And since the Elphys was sold for next to nothing, this way they will get her cheapest. Tarek agreed and said to take Sir Landis with him as well. Since he had been idle lately, he should at least work for his wages. Reifenhard decided to count his coins. He had 2,000 gold pieces, so there was more money left than expected, but still not enough to revive an entire empire. Reifenhard wondered if it might be worth investing them somewhere rather than carrying them around with him all the time. He thought that there was a famine in the kingdom of Provence, bordering the kingdom of Basil. It is, after all, an agricultural state. Its lands are rich and fertile due to the earth goddess Red Anti, so they couldn't even think of starvation. This was the cause of the horror that occurred the following spring, where even parents began to eat their children. Riefenhart thought it would be wise to help them with the problem. The trade organizations that came to his mind were Rolfine, Karen, and Tauban. Rolfine, however, would immediately fall away. There's no way Riefenhart would invest in their organization, as their head pervertedly abused Cirrus in a past life. Choosing among the remaining, Riefenhart preferred competitor Rolfine, which is the third largest trading organization and specializes in grain trading, the Tauban Association. The head of the Tauban Association, named Civil, was thinking about the damned Rolfine selling wheat for half the normal cost. Not a bit of business ethics, but it's still the second largest trade organization. Tauban is going to lose all its partners, and it's time to pay the bills soon, so it needs to be resolved sooner rather than later. Suddenly a servant came and informed Civil that he had a visitor and said he was ready to invest in their business. Civil replied that small sums would only aggravate the situation, not solve it, so he ordered him to send it away. Then the servant said that he was offering them 1,500 zlotys. Civil did not expect such a thing and even turned pale. Reifenhard brought 3 sacks of coins and said he wanted to invest in grain, and it would have to be delivered to the kingdom of Provence by the start of the harvest next spring. Civil was surprised and replied that this kingdom was not a good place, and the effect would be the same as if they tried to sell soap to orcs. No one would buy it. Reifenhard replied that the orcs would like the soap very much, if you let them get used to it. Civil didn't understand what he meant, and Reifenhard asked him to ignore it. Reifenhard said that if the investment doesn't pay off, he's the only one who will suffer losses. But if all goes according to plan, they could make good money. Civil replied that he couldn't approve a knowingly losing investment anyway. Then Reifenhard took the sacks and said that in that case he would go elsewhere. Civil stopped him in horror and said that the truth is, their organization is not going through the best of times, but that money will help them win the race against time and prosper. So he recommends investing in a safer option. Reifenhard remembered that Civil had been stubborn in his previous life too. It was his nature. So Reifenhard said that it was up to him to decide where to spend the money, and they should hurry up and bring the contract. Reifenhard then stepped closer to Civil and said menacingly that he would need to keep one single promise, not to spend his money on anything else. The frightened Civil replied that they would honor all the conditions. Reifenhard asked that their organization sort of had a branch in the kingdom of Graham. Civil replied that they did, and they had just recently paved a road to the north. Reifenhard then asked if they had a branch near the magic tower of Delphi. Civil replied that there is no branch there, but the path in that region leads through that tower. Reifenhard then asked for information about one person. Civil replied that there was no problem, and if he only needed a name, he would contact the branch in the Ranta region. Reifenhard realized that he needed to take the opportunity to find out everything about the current Reifenhard. Cirrus decided to do some training. Scylla watched this and was shocked. As she practiced, memories of the past came flooding back to Cirrus. She remembered her mother. Her mother had told her that they were high elves, once guardians of the forest. All lived happily under the protection of a great tree called Elfheim. Every animal was their friend, and the trees gave them endless fruit for sustenance. Her mother assured her that their people might be oppressed by humans now, but she believed that one day Eldia would bring their paradise back. She told Cirrus that they were heirs to the great fairies, and in no way should their pride be forgotten. And then one day, all around burst into flames. Little Cirrus watching the terror in the eyes of her people. Then a woman told little Cirrus that she would definitely be sold into good hands, and from now on, she would learn loyalty and gentleness to become a good commodity. Little Cirrus had a very hard time. People bullied as much as they could, beat her, and forced her to be submissive. The fact that she was superior and pure blood gave them something to mock. Her solace was the way of the sword. All the adults in her memories carried swords, fought bravely, and died with dignity. That was why she had grown to love blades. With a sword, Cirrus could invoke the pride of her parents, who fought without fear. A lot of time had passed since then, and the memories were beginning to fade. But one phrase she held deep in her heart. Her parents had asked her not to forget their pride. Cirrus finished her workout, and Sillin began to applaud her. He asked how she could move like that. Cirrus replied that all one has to do is try. Sillin started laughing and said that she sounded like Rifen, like it was a martial artist thing. Sillin tried to replicate Cirrus' movements and wondered if he was using the correct technique. The crowd of military men reappeared, and the same Romad said that they had finally found her. Romad then ordered the Elphas to follow him, and they would take her to her true master. Sillin asked who they were. Romad replied that they could count on no outside help since they had taken care of everything. Sillin began to shout that they had already been told that this elven girl was not for sale. Romad drew his sword and said that the little bastard was too talkative. But as soon as Romad swung at Sillin, Cirrus immediately planted her weapon and prevented the blow. The other warriors immediately attacked Cirrus. The slaughter began, and the girl fought bravely. She destroyed several military, and then Romad asked how dare a slave girl act like that. He noticed that she was quite strong. Suddenly Sillin started reciting an incantation and asking for the mace of righteous light to fall upon these insolent men. But as soon as Sillin uttered the words, a sword was launched at him. Cirrus pulled Sillin aside in time to save him. The sword was thrown by Romad. He said no one would care if a young pilgrim died. Sillin got very angry, but Cirrus calmed him down and told him that everything was fine. Then the girl went to Romad. Cirrus held out her weapon and said that these men were no danger to her. Romad got angry and summoned his biggest fighter, saying that Talcata would be a worthy opponent for her. Cirrus was surprised. It was the first time she had seen an orc warrior. The orc walked and kept repeating, Talcata to work, Talcata to catch the Elphas. The orc looked into Cirrus' eyes and said he was sorry, but they were powerless before fate, so all that remained was to accept it. The orc noticed that this elven woman's abilities were far greater than those of these humans. He didn't know if he could defeat her. Romad shouted to the orc that he needed this elven girl in one piece. The orc replied that he would just grab her. Cirrus readied her weapon, and the orc began to deliver the first blows, Cirrus deftly dodging. Cirrus noticed he was quite strong, and thought she shouldn't have left the saber in the room. Romad watched from the sidelines and started yelling for the orc not to hesitate and grab her. After all, couldn't he grab some elven girl? The orc got frustrated and thought that it looked like he would be without dinner tonight. Cirrus continued to attack. Cirrus then ran forward, and the orc rushed to catch up with her. He swung his sword and realized she wasn't dodging. And just when he thought it was the right moment, Cirrus stabbed him with her dagger. The orc thought he'd almost killed her if he hadn't deflected the blade at the last moment. Suddenly Sillin shouted to Cirrus and asked if she could fend off the flying daggers. The girl replied that one or two could. Sillin then began to recite a spell and said that he was relying on her. Romad noticed that Sillin had intervened again and drew his dagger. Romad threw a dagger at Sillin, but Cirrus managed to fend it off. Sillin, meanwhile, was reciting a spell, telling him to beat the bastards properly. Suddenly the spell worked. The warriors were scared. Now they only had to worry about their lives. Sillin told Cirrus that it was time for them to run, and though his skills work mostly on demons and undead, he could still buy some time. They ran forward, but suddenly Cirrus yelled to Sillin as a dagger flew at him. She realized that Sillin wouldn't be able to react in time, so she grabbed him and climbed up the wall. Cirrus jumped through the window and hugged Sillin to protect him from the shards of glass. Romad, meanwhile, ordered the orc Talcata to catch up with them now and bring him the elven girl. Suddenly a man appeared and asked Romad that they assholes had already managed to fail the mission, and they made so much noise because of a little girl. Romad replied that it was stronger than they had expected. The man smiled and said it was still with Talcata with them. He couldn't believe that an elven woman could stand up to a veteran orc warrior. So the man said he would have to intervene and asked where she had gone. Romad pointed in the direction Cirrus had gone, and the man used a technique to rise up. His aura shone with a bright light. The man stepped through the broken window. Romad watched from the side and wondered how he managed to jump so high. Romad then took a deep breath and said that there was nothing to be surprised about. After all, such were the abilities of the aura user. The man was walking down the hallway looking for Cirrus and saying that they were about to play hide and seek. Sillin and Cirrus were running ahead. Sillin suggested that she go back to the room to get her gear. Cirrus said that there would be people there, too, after all. Sillin replied that she could handle a couple of people, and that was better than running away with just a dagger. Cirrus was surprised, for before this she had thought that Sillin was just an ordinary carefree child. There was already a warrior standing outside the room, but before he knew it, Cirrus had attacked him and knocked him out. The boys entered the room, and Sillin told her that now was not the time to leisurely dress, They needed to grab their things and run away quickly. Sillin then recited a spell and asked them to erase their tracks to keep them out of danger. A man with a strong glowing aura was coming closer and closer. It was Landas, a swordsman who had achieved incredible skill in his craft and had awakened the aura. Landas already knew where they ran to. He knew they went to the room to get weapons. Possessors of the aura can clearly sense the movement of all living things within a radius of 30 meters, as if they could see them with their own eyes. Who would have thought that this child, as a first-class priest, possessed a skill that erased presence? Landas entered the room, knocking out the wall, and realized that they had already escaped from here. Suddenly Romad came in and asked if they had managed to get away. Landas ordered him to shut up and told him that they couldn't have gotten far, so the hound dogs had to be let out. Sillin and Cirrus were hiding. Cirrus wondered if they were better off lost among the streets. Sillin replied that they should try to avoid people, as those around them would immediately chase after them if they spotted a runaway slave. Sillin thought that the Holy Order had gotten very comfortable, and now it was clear why the pilgrims were dying like flies. He figured if he gave up and went back, she'd catch him again. And he couldn't go back with such a frail body. Sillin began to shout loudly that if Ryfin were here, everything would be resolved. Cirrus was surprised and asked if Mr. Ryfin was really that strong. Sillin replied that they had to find him at any cost. He began to recite the spell and ask Philinance to let her merciful protection grant them the thread of destiny, and that she would look upon their sorrowful parting and bring about a reunion. Sillin thundered, "Crossroads of destiny. Love turns coincidence into destiny. Through love, a chance encounter becomes a destined encounter. A man meets a woman and says that among the countless people on the entire continent, meeting her is like a miraculous coincidence. It may be a coincidence with a probability close to inevitability, but when it is blessed by Philinance, it becomes destiny." Sillin sighed heavily and thought that it had originally been a holy spell to bring couples together. Then Sillin told Cirrus that she was very strong, and he had only met Lelsia, also an elf warrior, but Cirrus was stronger. Cirrus replied that Sillin was already a high-class saint despite his young age. It was as if he was talking to a human and not a slave. Was Cirrus a special case? Cirrus said that they seemed to have arrived. The boys went outside, but they sensed something wrong. Cirrus covered Sillin and said it wasn't Mr. Ryfin. Lantas looked at them and said they were caught and thanked them for a good workout. Lantas began to move closer and said that he didn't advise them to run away again. Cirrus realized that if they tried to escape, their backs would be exposed. The only option left was to defeat him and get the hell out of there. Lantas accepted the challenge. He said Cirrus turns out to be not a rookie, but a talented fighter. The fight continued. Lantas said it seemed to take a lot of time and effort, which was unusual for a slave. Cirrus held herself well and continued to fight. However, she couldn't figure out what kind of person this was. Sillin noticed that judging from his skills, he was some kind of famous knight or swordsman. How could such a strong man be involved in such a case? Sillin began to cast a spell and asked that Cirrus be endowed with lion-like courage, to imbue her trembling sword in hands with the strength of giants, to fill her eyes with the eyesight of a hawk, to make her legs strong enough to slay a slave. Lantas was very surprised. After all, to cast so many spells at the same time was the level of a bishop. Sillin started yelling that he was pretty famous in southern Basil. Sillin shouted to Cirrus that she would succeed. Lantas said that next to the priest, Cirrus had changed beyond recognition. The girl continued the battle. Sillin supported her. Suddenly, Lantas shattered Cirrus's weapon with a single swing of his sword. She was so enthusiastic, and he was just playing along. And then Sillin was startled and realized that the wielder of the aura was standing before him. Lantas used the aura on the inferior warrior. Sillin ran up to Cirrus to help her. He couldn't understand what the man was even doing here. Aura wielders could live in luxury anywhere, and hiring them to capture a slave made as much sense as eating soup with a fork, and asked if Sir Lantas had caught them. Sillin heard this and realized who stood before him. Lantas asked Sillin what he knew of him. Lantas von Kalpanard, illustrious knight of the Tekin kingdom. Being a descendant of a noble family, he showed astonishing martial prowess when he awakened his aura after 30. The entire Tekin kingdom rejoiced at the arrival of a new aura wielder. However, Lantas had a disgusting secret that he kept to himself. He had an unimaginably horrible fetish that started with the slave elves, moved on to the people of the royal city, and then made its way to the nobility. He became the greatest disgrace in the history of the Tekin kingdom. Sillin began shouting that Lantas was a monster, all the while hiding in the principality of Caton. Lantas replied that Sillin knew a lot about him. Then Sillin said that he had been warned not to walk in the forest at night, for Lantas might appear. Sillin said that he was an aura wielder, but he did such nefarious things, and the rumors were true. He was incredibly mean. Lantis replied that he had to live on something. Lantis then said that he had killed hundreds of people in the Tekken Kingdom and escaped here. It had been a long time since he had caught up. Romad listened to this and thought that obviously for Ralph fine, the bad rumors about Lantis pale in comparison to the benefit he brings. And he can also be given all sorts of dirty work, and Lantis will get his money and live happily ever after. All on the plus side. Romad realized that the wielder of the aura was a symbol of the pinnacle of power, and thanks to Lantis, they had become the second largest trade alliance in the Catan Kingdom. Lantis applied his aura and said that it was time to seal Silen's sacred powers for a while. He knows full well what a high-class priest's freedom of speech leads to. Silen felt helpless. Romad asked Lantis not to cause any more time for the Elphus, as Mr. Tarek wouldn't like it. Lantis asked what if they couldn't get a priest to come and heal her, and asked her not to make things worse. Lantis then looked at Silen and said that this girl was pretty too, and they would take her with them as well. Romad sighed and thought it was starting again. Silen started yelling that he was a man. Lantis smiled and said that since he was a man, it would be a new experience, something extremely interesting. Lantis put his hand up to Silen and said he would take good care of him. Silen cut his hand with a dagger and said he would not lay a finger on him. Lantis marveled that Silen was able to stand up in his severed tendons without healing magic. Then he looked at it and said that it was, after all, the most beautifully immaculate and neat zombie in the world. Silen held himself very bravely, and Lantis said he was sorry they would have to cut off his legs. But suddenly there was an incredibly loud and powerful explosion. The shock waved through the soldier's back. Reifenhardt appeared. He started yelling loudly that finally they had found the bastards. Silen almost tearfully began to shout that it was Reifen. And Reifenhardt angrily asked how they dared to pursue Cirrus. Reifenhardt came closer and closer, and on the way he took off his coat. His look was very fierce, and realized that he was far from his usual trim self. He felt a strong aura from Reifenhardt. Lantis asked who it was. Romad said he was the one who bought the elf girl. Then Lantis asked what kind of idiot saw him as a regular guy. Lantis' gut was literally screaming danger at the mere sight of this guy, and they called him some kid. Lantis realized that since he, the wielder of the aura, couldn't sense his level, it meant that he possessed it as well. Reifenhardt approached Silen and thanked him for protecting Cirrus. Lantis couldn't understand how such a young man could have an aura, but also Lantis was sure that Reifenhardt only looked young, and he must be in his 30s. Lantis said that it had been a long time since he had met someone so strong. A furious Reifenhardt said for Lantis not to pretend to be a knight when he himself is only a dirty, horny old man. He waved 2 fingers and told Lantis to attack. Lantis was seized with anger and drew his sword, but as soon as he did, Reifenhardt was already flying at him with a burning fist. He delivered a blow that sent Lantis tumbling to the ground, punching a hole in it. The fall was powerful and loud. Lantis managed to get up, but Reifenhardt was already standing over him. Reifenhardt hadn't been this angry in a long time. He struck one blow after another. There was no way Lantis could hit him with his sword. One of the warriors asked if it would be better for them to run away from here. Romad replied that they would die if they got hurt, even a little while they were running away. As the battle continued, Silen regained his powers and managed to heal Cirrus. Cirrus came to her senses and asked that if Mr. Reifen was the owner of the aura. Silen smiled and asked that hadn't he mentioned it before. Lantis meanwhile realized he was in trouble, as those who had only recently awakened their aura couldn't do so. Lantis let his aura into the sword and surrounded Reifenhardt with it. Then Reifenhardt used the bullet chi. Lantis was shocked at how skillfully Reifenhardt handled the aura. He thought that Reifenhardt had awakened his aura as a child, or that he was in his late 40s. Neither made any sense right now. Lantis was in this situation for the first time. Reifenhardt wondered during the fight why Lantis was so strong, and how the filthy pervert who had molested Cirrus could be so skillful with a sword. Reifenhardt concentrated his strength and thought he would beat anyone who said martial arts didn't build character. Lantis struck again and was shocked again. He didn't understand how he had managed to deflect the sword with his bare hands. And then Lantis had an idea. He asked Reifenhardt if he was Gerard's apprentice. Reifenhardt answered nothing. Then Lantis asked, "Is it necessary to worry about a slave with such strength?" When Reifenhardt heard this, he became very angry and asked whom he had called a slave. Then he shouted loudly that these slaves had feelings and wills of their own. Reifenhardt ran at Lantis to strike, and wondered if Lantis had tried to talk to them, or at least find out why they had become them. Reifenhardt struck a powerful and hard blow that sent Lantis flying backwards, punching the stone wall with his body. Lantis barely managed to get to his feet, and he replied to Reifenhardt that he didn't understand what nonsense he was talking about. Reifenhardt remembered that everyone in a past life had reacted the same way. The belief that all beings other than humans are inferior is so deeply rooted in humanity. They see the laughter and tears of creatures from another world, but they don't even think they have emotions. Reifenhard asked Lantas how humans were better than elves, since they treated them like slaves. Lantas replied that they were the crown of nature, and that was the only way they should deal with these creatures. And so said Sayer. Reifenhard asked what else they were supposed to be. Were the descendants of the great fairy born to be slaves? Anger and even resentment soaked Reifenhard. He shouted loudly that Cirrus was not a slave. This system is now entrenched on the continent, so that the weak and infirm resemble slaves by their existence. That's what serfdom is. Implementing the wrong ideology always boomerangs back. And stupid people don't realize that. Unless the shackles are broken, unless their worldview is changed, one day everyone will begin to live in fear of those shackles. Reifenhard realized that this had to change, and he had to do it no matter what. With such an ideology inside his heart, Reifenhard struck a decisive blow that made Lantas start spitting blood. Reifenhard then raised his fist up and said that he would change everything at any cost, and no one dare call Cirrus a slave, and no one would be called a slave anymore. And for Cirrus' sake, Reifenhard would change the world. When she heard that, Cirrus couldn't tell if Mr. Reifenhard was in his right mind. Cirrus was going over in her head everything she had heard. She thought Reifenhard was crazy. Cirrus didn't realize how much of a role player he had to be to say such a thing. Was he really a hopeless pervert? At this time Lantas, stoned, begged Reifenhard to spare him. Reifenhard asked why he would spare the twisted bastard. Lantas swore on his sword that he would atone for his sins and do only good from now on. Reifenhard replied, the look on his face indicating that Lantas was lying. Then Reifenhard said that he really hated the Holy Order of Sayer. He asked Lantas that one could do any sin, only to confess it in church at the end. Reifenhard said that Lantas would have surrendered immediately if he was truly repentant. And then why go to church? Lantas replied that in that case he would surrender, and there was no need to smear his hands on such a scoundrel. Reifenhard hesitated and replied that the foul blood was already marring his hands. Lantas strained a smile and said he would believe him. Reifenhard asked him that if he really repents, then he thinks he deserves to die, doesn't he? And hopes to die quickly and pay for his sins. Lantas began to shout, no. Scylla and Cirrus froze. And Reifenhard struck that final blow. He said that you shouldn't devalue repentance with your filthy mouth. And such a bastard shouldn't even say such a thing. Reifenhard then approached Cirrus and asked if she was injured. Scylla replied that he had already healed her. Reifenhard smiled and replied that it was as expected from the best first aid kit. Cirrus asked if Reifenhard's body was okay. Reifenhard almost went crazy with happiness that she had spoken to him. Cirrus thought he was really strange. Suddenly, Scylla said that some villains were running away. Reifenhard immediately ordered them to stand still. Reifenhard told them that if they were trying to escape, they could try. And something interesting awaits them then. Romad did not venture any further, and Reifenhard asked him who had given them the order to bring Cirrus. Reifenhard then said that it was expected that they wouldn't crack so easily. The warriors did not understand why Reifenhard took out a club. Soon he was trying to beat information out of them with the club. Finally, they confessed that it was Tarek, the head of the Ralfine trade organization. They said he lived on the southern edge of Zeppelin. Reifenhard immediately remembered that Tarek was the bastard who had bullied Cirrus for 10 years in his past life. Then the first thing he wanted to do was kill the bastard while he rescued Cirrus. But unfortunately, when he found him, he was already dead. Romad asked Reifenhard, wondering if he was thinking of going after him. After all, even he wouldn't be able to do that, because Tarek owns the second largest trade organization in the kingdom of Caton. And if you do anything to him, you could become the enemy of everyone here. Reifenhard replied that he knows that. He also knows very well what a scumbag he is, and the boys went on their way. And lastly, Reifenhard said that as he had promised, he was leaving them alive. And if they stuck together, Tarek's friend asked him when the elf girl who had been brought back would arrive. Tarek replied that Romad the idiot was running late. The man asked Tarek why he bought those elves. Tarek said that it was payment to Sir Lantas. Then the man said that it was too noisy outside today. Tarek replied that it must be one of those days when beggars are noisy. The warriors were attacking Reifenhard. He tried only to disarm them, but it was difficult not to kill them. Therefore, Scylla would immediately read a spell to the wounded to erase their painful memories. Reifenhard asked, that isn't the spell Scylla uses to heal broken hearts. After all, it clouds the memory. Scylla replied that physical attacks also painful memories. Scylla asked Reifenhard that if it weren't for his powers, what he would have done with the witnesses. Reifenhard replied that he would have just gone alone and walked out with the freak's head. Scylla replied that it was a good thing he could erase memories. and he couldn't wait to watch the bastard die. Suddenly Talcata appeared in their path and said that he would not let the trespassers pass. Reifenhard told the orc that the blood of a warrior runs in him, and the one he protects is not worth his strength. So why swing a sword for him? The orc replied that he was a warrior, and as a sword wielder he had duties. After all, how can you call yourself a warrior if you are defeated and your will is broken? Then Reifenhard asked if it was his will to be a slave. The orc was taken aback and hesitated. Reifenhard told him that the man was not his mentor. The orc replied that it didn't matter and that a warrior's job was to carry out the task assigned to him. Reifenhard asked, even through the force? Talcata replied that was exactly right. Sillin was very surprised and asked if Reifen understood orcs. Cirrus wondered if the Reifenhard spoke the language of grace. She told him she would deal with the orc. Reifenhard asked her if she was going to be okay. Cirrus replied that she had a different weapon this time. The orc looked at Cirrus and called her a weak elf. Then he added that she had gotten stronger. Reifenhard asked Sillin to keep his eyes open, and if something happens and it gets dangerous, he knows what to do. Sillin asked him not to worry as he is a pro at this. The orc asked Reifenhard that he was ignoring him and going after Tarek. Reifenhard replied that his opponent was an elven woman across the street, and that it was rude to be distracted during combat. The orc immediately turned around and said he was right. Reifenhard thought that was the nature of orcs. Reifenhard walked straight down the hallway and finally realized he had arrived. Because he smelled the acrid odor of drugs, Reifenhard entered the room. Tarek wondered who the jerk had come in and tried to call for security. Reifenhard said he's seen a lot of dirt, but this is one he definitely won't forgive them for. Tarek got angry and started yelling and asking who he was. Reifenhard at that moment noticed the slaughtered elven women at his back. Reifenhard couldn't contain his anger. He asked why there were so few people worthy of life in their world. Tarek started calling loudly for the orc Talcat. He didn't understand what was going on, or why no one had raised the alarm while the stranger was making his way here. Tarek, with fear in his eyes, asked Reifenhard what he wanted and how much money to pay him. He then asked that maybe Reifenhard needed a market. After all, it must be the shenanigans of the Tauben trade union. Tarek began to swear in Rolfane's name that he would double the amount they had given. Suddenly, Reifenhard said aloud that Cirrus had been under that animal for 10 years. He then told Tarek that he hadn't changed at all. Tarek kept saying that he could draw up the contract right now, and would even promise not to retaliate. Suddenly, Reifenhard punched him in the stomach, whereupon all the abomination he had ingested began to come out of Tarek. Tarek began to ask what he was doing to him. Reifenhard grabbed him by the hair and told him that such a creature dared to touch Cirrus. Reifenhard continued to beat him and said that with these hands he defiled her and with these feet he kicked her. It's hard to even describe what he was doing to her. Reifenhard then said that he might find everything unfair and asked if he imagined how the dead felt because of him. Tarek's buddy started yelling that Reifenhard was a villain for killing him. Reifenhard replied that it was ridiculous and asked that isn't he the same. He replied that he had nothing to blame himself for. Reifenhard said that he was unlikely to blame himself. Then Reifenhard hit him too. Cirrus and Sillin came into the room, and seeing this, Cirrus said that it was very cruel. Reifenhard replied that those bastards deserve the worst. Sillin said he agreed. Cirrus told Sillin that he was apparently used to this sort of thing. Sillin replied that he had spent a lot of time traveling. Sillin then told Reifenhard that Cirrus took care of Talcat, and that she is strong and coping even without his help. Cirrus had said that if Sillin hadn't been with her, she wouldn't be standing here. Reifenhard felt that Talcata didn't seem to be dead. His breathing was weak. Suddenly Beret came to his senses and recognized Cirrus. He started screaming that she was the warrior he had brought back. Cirrus looked at the slain elven women and asked Bereth if he had killed that child. Bereth asked her what she would do if it was him. Cirrus drew her sword and said his life was too cheap to pay off the child's soul, but it was the least she could do. Beret began to scream and asked where her logic was if she wanted to kill him over a slave girl. Cirrus didn't say anything and destroyed him. Bereth fell at the feet of the healed elf and begged for mercy. Cirrus immediately threw another blow and told him not to dare touch her with his filthy hands. Reifenhard looked into Cirrus's eyes and nodded. Cirrus saw something familiar in that look. Cirrus and Sillin gathered all the slaves left there and led them out into the forest. Talcata approached Cirrus and reported that the 7 elven women and 9 orcs were all the slaves that were there. Talcata said as he bowed to her. Sillin looked around and said that rather sharp gender ratio. Cirrus replied that elf men and orc women weren't that popular. Cirrus remembered Reifenhardt's speech again when he had dealt with Lantis. She realized she had been wrong about him. Reifenhardt suddenly arrived and apologized for keeping them waiting. He carried a scroll in his hand. Sillin asked what he had in his hand. Reifenhardt said it was a slave contract. He also grabbed the seal of the head of Rolfin. It was hard to find, because it was an important document. Sillin asked where he found it. Riefenhard said that he came across the safe when he broke the wall of the room. Sillin said that was quite barbaric. Riefenhard replied that he had never heard anything like that in 50 years. Sillin asked in surprise. Riefenhard turned around and replied as he left that nothing. At that moment, he began to think that he was becoming a simpleton. Sillin asked why Riefenhard had brought the contract. Riefenhard replied that they needed it. Then he approached the slaves and said that if they did not want to live as slaves, he would grant them freedom. He asked what they would choose. The elves and orcs began to whisper among themselves. They began to ask what freedom was. No one understood what the new master wanted from them. Riefenhard realized that they didn't even know what freedom was. Sillin asked Riefenhard if he really wanted to do a slave exchange. Riefenhard replied that he had no intention of selling them to anyone else. Sillin then asked if he planned to give up his life as a traveler and settle down. Riefenhard said that if he put the seal of Rolfin, then they would no longer be slaves of Tarek, and then nothing would threaten them anymore. Riefenhard just wanted to let these guys go, who had neither the desire to leave nor a place to go. But he knew that now it was the same as leaving them to die of cold and hunger. They had to learn to survive. Together with all the slaves, arrived at the Taubin Union. Civil was very surprised and asked Riefenhard if these slaves did not belong to Tarek, the head of the trade union. He asked how Riefenhard had bought them all. Riefenhard replied that Civil would find out about it later, but for now they had to be taken care of secretly. Riefenhard also said that tomorrow morning Civil will learn interesting news, and he alone will have to unravel the whole truth. And if the secret came out, the only suspect would be him. Civil couldn't understand what was going on. Riefenhard said it was just a common threat, and nothing to worry about. Said that he would give him gold to start with. That should be enough to take care of them for a while. Civil thought that this guy must have robbed Rolfin's mansion. He told Riefenhard that he had a place on the outskirts of Zeppelin, and no one would know if Civil left them there with his slaves. Riefenhard asked if Civil could guarantee that no one would lay a finger on them. Civil replied that he understood that slave owners were very jealous of their servants. But here 100 zlotys would be too much. Riefenhard said that with this money he should also give them an education. Civil asked that didn't they get it under Tarek's control. Riefenhard said he wasn't talking about slave training. Language and numbers, accounting, history, philosophy, and medicine and healing. Civil was extremely surprised and asked why they had to go to such extremes and give slaves an education. Riefenhard replied that there was nothing unusual about that, and the more a slave could do, the more useful he was to his master. Civil replied that it was impossible to teach them anything like that. Riefenhard said that no one knows, and besides, it's his money that's at stake. If everything works out, the slaves will become more valuable, so Civil will benefit from it too. Then Civil said that since Riefenhard so desired, he would try, but it would not be easy, since there would be no scholar willing to teach a slave. Riefenhard replied that he knew very well that they were rather arrogant, and Civil asked what they should do then. Riefenhard replied that the scientists had students, and some of them were probably peasants who urgently needed money. It was worth asking them. Civil asked in surprise how someone who had not yet mastered the subject could teach. Riefenhard explained that he did not need anything great. He should just give them basic knowledge, and it would also be cheaper. Then Civil said that it would be as he wished, but he could not imagine that the slaves would understand even a little. It was like teaching a cat or a dog to count. Riefenhard was thinking that it wasn't so strange to educate slaves, and there were people trying to push that idea. But the upper class rejected this idea in their past life. They thought it was like teaching a dog to draw. All because of the ingrained stereotype that creatures from another world are inferior to humans. Civil thought that he could use this to his advantage. Riefenhard reasoned that the reason they don't actually train the slaves is because they are afraid of them rebelling, which is why they take such measures. And it seems that now people do not know what exactly was the reason for this. As soon as the slaves receive an education, Civil will be shocked by the level of their abilities, and immediately begins to teach his slaves. It is more convenient for the master when the slave can do a lot. And if everything goes according to plan, slave training will spread across the entire continent. Riefenhard failed to change people's worldviews, but now everything will be different. Riefenhard asked Sillin if he had any money. Sillin asked what was the matter, and Riefenhard said that he had accidentally given Civil all his money and had forgotten to leave some for the journey. Cirrus offered to return her dress and take the money. Riefenhard shamefully began to shout that they would not do that. Riefenhard didn't notice, but Cirrus laughed for the first time since becoming a slave. Zeppelin was in an uproar. The head of the Great Alliance, Rolfian, and the heir to the Trade Alliance, Kareth, the killer is unknown. The workers were interrogated, but no one remembered anything. The warriors tried to remember some events and said that they remembered a huge, beautiful elf. The case could not be solved due to discrepancies in testimony. Therefore, no one was ever punished. Sillin recited the spell and asked Philinins to shed the light of purification on these cursed creatures and pay special attention to this monster. Meanwhile, Cirrus was fighting with living skeletons. Riffenhart watched from the sidelines and said that they worked well together. Well, to be more precise, Sillin tries to satisfy Cirrus' needs. Riffenhart assumed that Sillin had been training with the team since his youth, and how old was he when he stepped onto the battlefield? Sillin was much stronger than Riffenhart thought, and if he continued to improve his skills in the same spirit, he would become stronger than Riffenhart's sworn enemy. Riffenhart did not understand why Sillin had not become famous in his past life. Had he really died young? Riffenhart asked Sillin how he was doing and if he was hurt. Sillin said that Riffenhart said that these ruins are called Illusion, and he thinks that the monsters here are stronger than in Palton. Riffenhart replied that, in fact, this rabble was weaker since they came in through the back door. They arrived in the Kingdom of Graham 2 weeks after leaving Khitan. Near the Setlard Mountains lie forgotten ancient ruins. An item that is extremely necessary for restoring Riffenhart's magic is located in this place. Riffenhart said they had finally arrived. Sillin replied that the door was sealed with magic, but he didn't think they could open it with brute force. Sillin asked what they should do now, since he had suggested hiring a mage. Riffenhart asked them to wait, since he needed to cast a spell. Sillin asked in surprise what spell, and whether Riffenhart could use magic. Riffenhart replied that he had once been a mage. Sillin asked in horror if he was a battle mage. Sillin almost went crazy, because he was strong in martial arts. He asked Riffenhart what he was doing. Riffenhart replied that he was gathering mana. Sillin replied that it didn't take much for the third circle spell. Riffenhart began to chant a spell in the name of the ancient power of the seal, asking to open what was closed. Sillin noted that it took 30 minutes, and told Riffenhart not to tell anyone else that he was a mage. Riffenhart told him to shut up, because the door eventually opened. In his past life, Riffenhart was the world's first 10th circle mage, so he decided to urgently find the voice of the illusion, because he couldn't continue to be so terrible. The boys went inside, and then Riffenhart was speechless. He couldn't understand why it was empty. They began to return back. Riffenhart still could not understand how this had happened. Sillin told him that they couldn't always be first, since Riffenhart wasn't the master of the ruins. Riffenhart realized that the future had changed. Since Illusion would only be found 17 years later, that's why Riffenhart found it then. Sillin said that the good thing is that they did get something, and it was also a pretty good artifact. Cirrus knew well that his arrows consist of mana, and if you concentrate hard, you can shoot several times in a row. It looks like an ordinary stick, but in fact it is a branch of Elfheim. Sillin said it looked like a piece of wood, but it was a bow. He asked Cirrus how she liked it. The girl replied that it was a great weapon. Sillin was surprised that someone could leave such a powerful weapon behind and asked Riffenhart how he knew it was an artifact. Riffenhart remembered that this was Cirrus' main weapon in her past life, but he told Sillin that he had heard of it before. Sillin said that there were still plenty of ancient ruins on the continent, so there was no need to worry. Riffenhart understood that no relic could replace the voice of the illusion. The boys walked on, and then Sillin said that they had finally reached the village of Gahalan, and he wanted to eat food cooked by someone else for once. Soon the boys ordered a whole table of delicious food. The hostess said that it was very good that they ate so much and asked if they had enough. Cirrus replied that it was very tasty. Riffenhart said that their cook skill was simply top-notch. The woman said that all the previous guests had complained about their food, probably thinking they were restaurant critics. Sillin asked who dared to do that. The woman said that a gang of knights from a noble family had been here a week ago, and they said that they were going to explore some ruins. Riffenhart handed the woman a coin and asked her to tell him more. The woman refused the coin and said that telling a story was not work. She said that Viscount Kelberin had come here a week ago with a team of researchers, but it turned out that they were higher in status than the Viscount. Among them, there was even a knight in golden armor, shining from head to toe, even funny somehow. Although he was nice, Riffenhart realized that if there was golden armor and a golden sword, then only one person fits that description. The Golden Knight of the Kingdom of Graham, from the Tense family of counts. The commander of the knights from the Tense family named Eustace was dining with the Viscount, who said that he was simply incredible. Eustace replied that it was all thanks to him, but the man said that it was Eustace who defeated all the monsters in the ruins. As expected of the Golden Knight of Graham, Eustace told the Viscount not to worry, because, as promised, a third of the treasure found would be his. The Viscount smiled and replied that he had the honor of fighting alongside him and asked what treasures were in question. and he did not mind if Yussus took everything. The Viscount understood that he had enough money, but a good relationship with Yussus would not hurt. Yussus asked what they had done with the adamantium and orichalcum they had found. The Viscount replied that he had told the villagers that they needed to make weapons. Yus said that it was as expected from the Kelburn family, famous for their mining industry, and they probably have many talented dwarfs. The Viscount replied that it was nothing of the sort, and now his daughters came. The Viscount bade them greet the great Golden Knight of Graham. The Viscount told Yus that he knew he was married, but he thought it would be a good idea for them to get to know each other better. Yus replied that he had no plans to get closer to anyone other than his wife. Vicon realized that this had hurt him. Then he tried to start a conversation about Yussus's younger brother. But as soon as the Viscount said the word brother, Yus's face immediately changed. He crushed a glass, cutting his hand, and said that he did not have a younger brother. The Viscount and the girls were frightened. He immediately asked for forgiveness and said that he had made a fatal mistake. The butler ran into the room and started shouting that a demon had appeared from some relic, and this demon Sophiadin. He destroyed one soldier after another. No one could cope with him. Yus thought that among the treasures there was a summoning artifact. He looked menacingly and called the Viscount a blockhead. A knight came to the rescue, shouting to the soldiers to beware of the demon's sword, and also to evacuate people and maintain formation. He ordered the mages to go to the rear and the knights to raise their shields. He himself went forward and prepared for battle. The magicians began to cast spells. They asked to give everyone who had valor the strength to destroy this evil. The magicians turned to the icy wind and commanded the demon to follow their hands and take a position. That same night, Russ stepped forward and said that this was an excellent job, and now we need to tie the demon's legs and wait for the commander. The knights began to ask Russ what he was doing. Meanwhile, Russ raised his sword and began to shout that there was no enemy before the face of Tint's sword. Russ lunged at the demon, and with a movement of his sword made a vertical cut across the demon. This only made the demon even more angry and threw him back. The knights began to shout that he was an idiot. At this time, the demon entered a more aggressive phase. Suddenly, Yussus appeared and ordered Sir Lot to leave the fools and maintain the network. The knights began to shout that the commander had returned. Yus looked at the boy and asked who his brother was. After all, the great knights of Tints were not born dirty stray dogs. Russ was very upset. Yus said that Sophiadin is a demon, not subject to those who do not have an aura. Yussus took out his golden sword and, calling it Eldred, asked him to open his eyes. The sword immediately changed its structure and aura, and then Yussus's entire body began to shine with a bright golden light. And Yussus found himself completely in golden armor. Reifenhart asked Sillin what Yussus is, the Golden Knight. Sillin replied that he was very famous, and he asked Riffenhart that he had not heard of him. Riffenhart smiled and replied that he had lived in the mountains. Then Cirrus told him that Yussus was one of the strongest magical swordsmen on his continent, so strong that he could compare to the owner of the aura. Riffenhart was surprised and said that the pajamas suited her very well, and asked if she liked them. Cirrus replied that she did. Sillin said that even if Yussus was strong, how could a magic swordsman be compared to an aura user? It was just the power of a magic strike. Reifenhart replied that his magical armor was the strongest in their era, although the ability to skillfully wield it was a completely different matter. Golden Eldril is a magical metal that is much rarer than silver mithril. The Eldred magic armor and the Eldrin magic sword, made from this gold, are the greatest artifacts among the treasures of the Silver Age. They were passed down from generation to generation. A magical swordsman who uses Eldred and Eldrin is called a Golden Knight. When wearing the first one, simple words can activate powerful magic, allowing one to gain power comparable to the owner of the aura, provided it is used correctly. At this time, Yussus was fighting the demon. He ordered Eldrin to wake up, and then he used the 8th circle spell of material destruction. Reifenhart was arguing that at least the county of Tinham had learned to use Eldred's power. But a good tool does not make anyone all-powerful. Sillin told Riffenhard that he thought too highly of magic swordsmen, and that he had heard that the aura wielders did not recognize them. Riffenhart replied that it was because the technique of using the magic armor of the Tints County was more thorough than most sword techniques. Yussus was casting a spell to pierce the eye of the god of death and passed the cry of the leopard ring through his body to feel this world with the feelings of a dragon. Reifenhard heard that they had lost all the necessary sword techniques, so they had to rely on relics. But from their family's perspective, and even diligent training and honing of sword skills do not guarantee the manifestation of the aura. But they have a golden knight for every generation. Yussus was conjuring a heat wave to strike his enemy and Reifenhart was arguing that a martial artist with the power of an aura wielder was a big plus for the family. But being a magical swordsman using Eldred is not as easy as it may seem. Justus struck the demon and begged it to disappear. The demon was torn into several pieces. Reifenhart was lying on the bed and discussing which of the two was stronger. Sillin asked Reifenhart if he was going to fight him. Reifenhart replied that they needed to retrieve the artifact. Then Sillin asked what they were doing to steal it. He said that he had allied himself with Reifenhart in the Principality of Caton because he was right. Count Tintz explored the ruins and became the rightful owner of the artifact, and there is nothing like that here. And if they take the artifact from him, then it turns out that they are thieves. Reifenhart replied that Sillin was right. Reifenhart thought about how to convince Sillin, but without telling him about his past life. Then he turned to him and said that he wanted to tell him something. Reifenhart asked Sillin if he knew that he was from the clan of the Invincible Warrior. Sillin replied that he had heard that he was Gerard's apprentice. Reifenhart said there was more. Several tests needed to be passed to complete the training. Sillin asked if his master had hidden the artifact in the ruins and told him to retrieve it. Reifenhart replied that it was a traditional training for apprentices and that their clan was a bit rough around the edges. Sillin said that it turned out that teacher Gerard had already explored the Aleutian ruins once, but did not take the Silver Age artifacts. Reifenhart replied that this was because the other artifacts obtained by the students during the test were their reward. Reifenhart asked Sillin to think of another way he could have learned about Nihilin without having heard of it beforehand. And what about secret and bypassing routes into the dungeon? Sillin realized that Reifen was right. He said that in that case there was nothing to be done, and he understood Reifenhart. Reifenhart exhaled and mentally apologized to him for this lie. And Sillin also said that he initially found it all strange, and no matter how valuable the legacy of that era was, he would never have thought that Reifenhart was thirsty for something foreign. Sillin then asked what it meant that he had to get the artifact back at any cost. Reifenhart replied that it was, and that was why he was worried. Sillin said that it was all very confusing and asked if they were sure that theft was all that was left. Reifenhart replied that there was nothing to be done, since things had turned out that way. One of the warriors praised Justus for his excellent work and said that as expected, even Sophiatnin did not stand a chance against the Golden Knight. Russ suddenly ran up, and Justus told him that the swordsman who used the downward slash technique was no longer a Tintz, and Russ should know where his place was. Russ gritted his teeth and replied that he was still Tintz's swordsman, and it didn't matter what Justus thought. The next day Russ was busy training. Suddenly, some soldiers came up to him and asked why he had pulled that stunt yesterday. Russ replied that he was only trying to defeat the demon. The soldiers said that no one asked him, and asked if he hadn't heard the order to wait for the commander. Russ glared at them and replied that he was also a Tintz's swordsman, and if they had any problems, they could challenge him to a duel and he would fight them head-on. The soldiers turned around and left, calling Russ a dirty mongrel. The boy could barely contain his anger. Russ is strong, but he only knows one fighting skill, a downward strike, and the accompanying breathing technique. The blade cuts through the air at the perfect angle, and the timing is so perfect that the movements are imperceptible. The sword master would not have been stingy with praise upon seeing his brilliant strike, but Russ's execution of other techniques was incredibly sloppy. The Tintz family had forgotten the true art of swordsmanship, but as a noble family with a knightly heritage, they had their own techniques. His father told Russ that was all he could teach him. Due to his dirty blood, Russ was forbidden from learning the true art of the sword. In the end, his father only passed on one technique to him. He told Russ that this was part of the great sword mastery that their family originally possessed, and also a direct path to the aura. Father hoped that Russ would still succeed in awakening the power that had been forgotten for centuries. His father was full of hope, and Russ did not want to break it. The true art of the Tintz sword, which was once able to release the power and its only fragment, a forgotten piece of shoddy craftsmanship. Justus claimed that he would achieve nothing with such a simple blow. The rest of the art had long since disappeared. Justus called him an idiot, but as he thought, the bastard was a genius. Reifenhart could not believe that he was doing this after being reborn, jumping over a fence in a mask. Reifenhart wondered why the Lord's castle was so huge, and he remembered that the Viscount was famous for mining, or it must be the work of the dwarves. Then Reifenhart walked up to the entrance of the castle and, apologizing, knocked out the guards. The soldiers patrolled the castle and discussed how they did not understand the Lord. After all, Graham already had a golden knight, and who would dare attack this place, and in such a way that they would have to be called in as well? One of the soldiers said that the knights from the capital wear amazing glowing armor, and their lord is also a knight, but from a different class. One of the soldiers thought he saw something, and at that moment, Riffenhard realized that the thieves weren't just clinging to the ceiling like lizards. The soldiers left and Riffenhard continued moving forward. He thought that he had tried it once, and now it was not so scary. Riefenhard was surprised that the guards were wearing such impressive equipment. They must be knights of tints. Riefenhard attacked them and realized that strangulation was indeed the best way to silently eliminate an opponent. He found a barrier that captured movement and spells that recognized heat. Riefenhard knew what it was, but he was irritated by the fact that he couldn't defuse it. He realized that since there was a magical barrier, its core must be somewhere here. Then he discovered that there were runes carved into the stone. Riefenhard crushed the stone and the barrier disappeared. Now he could enter freely. He discovered there a secret anti-magic treasure and a sealing vessel, a bottomless bag, and even a heavenly harp. Riefenhard assumed they had arranged everything in a special order, but who had done that? Then he said it was not the Halthian blade, but the Taulad sword. And although they look similar, their magical properties are different. Riefenhard couldn't believe it, and suddenly Riefenhard noticed what he had come here for. A beautiful bright box. It was the voice of the Aleutian. Riefenhard took a step forward to take it, and then his foot hit the rope. Riefenhard was horrified and realized that it was a damn trick with the rope. The guards found the intruder in the south tower. Riefenhard couldn't believe he had gone through so much trouble to fall for such a stupid trap. Riefenhard fought off the soldiers. He understood that if he miscalculated his strength, one of them would definitely die. But now it was quite difficult to restrain himself. The commander-in-chief ordered everyone to hold their positions and the mages to fire. Riefenhard continued to fight back. He grabbed one of the soldiers and said that he was truly sorry. Another soldier noticed this and asked Riefenhard how rotten his soul was that he used a living shield. Riefenhard used it because of the enchanted armor. The commander-in-chief ordered the fire to be released, and then arrows with chains flew at Riefenhard. He couldn't understand what it was. He realized that they were trying to restrict his movement, and that was a pretty good thing. Riefenhard noted that they had too many skills for knights. Suddenly, Russ appeared and began shouting that the villain would now taste the Tint's family sword. The commander-in-chief started shouting that Ras shouldn't do that. Riefenhard was surprised and thought, what kind of a fool is this? The commander-in-chief kept shouting that Russ would destroy everything. However, the boy did not listen to anyone. Riefenhard thought that he didn't remember anyone with that name. Maybe he was imagining it? Riefenhard noticed that his movements, breathing, and steps were rather mediocre. However, what kind of blow was this? Ras attacked Riefenhard, but was unable to resist him. Riefenhard threw him back. Riefenhard didn't understand how, with such power, he couldn't dodge something like that. There was clearly something wrong with him. Riefenhard heard a spell to make the heavenly sword cut through everything in its path. Riefenhard realized that the Golden Knight of the Kingdom of Graham had arrived. Justice told Riefenhard that he had extraordinary abilities for a common robber. Riefenhard replied that he had his reasons. Just replied that they would talk about it later. To strike first is the motto of the trained invincible warrior. So Riefenhard went into battle. Justice and Riefenhard clashed in battle. They both knew that their opponent was strong enough. The commander-in-chief and the soldiers could not understand what Sir Justice was doing and what they were doing at all. Riefenhard thought that only suicides attacked like that. Just realized that it didn't work. Then Justice cast a spell and said that he would become the shadow roar of the abyss. Riefenhard was not surprised. He deflected the attack. Just couldn't understand how Riefenhard knew about the weaknesses of his technique. He said that his resistance to magic was worthy of respect. Riefenhard replied that it was not for nothing that he knew his spells. Then he used his signature blow. Justice almost went crazy. He couldn't understand how he managed to inflict such damage, even taking into account the armor. Yus began to cast a spell so that the wind would become his arrows and the flames would merge together and strike the enemy. And finally, Justice cast a spell to awaken Eldrin. A powerful explosion occurred. Riefenhard thought that he might die like that. Justice was a very worthy opponent. Then Riefenhard noticed the destruction of matter. He couldn't believe that Justice could use magic of such a high level. Justice was surprised that Riefenhard simply blocked the blow. He couldn't believe that after that he was still okay, but Yus did not see him dodge, and the owner of outstanding powers of perception did not see his movements. And then Yus suggested that maybe he possessed an aura. But this is completely impossible for someone like him. Justice cast a spell to cause the breath of corrosion to cut through space, and the caustic liquid came out into space. Riefenhard realized that it was acid fog, and that it could be avoided with a little pressurized air. Riefenhard broke free and struck. Now Justice had no doubt. He was absolutely sure that Riefenhard had an aura. Yus thought that his weakness was the inability to assess his true strength, but now that everything has become clear, the situation will change. All that was left was to give him a worthy rebuff. Yus said that when it came to aura, the tin sword would definitely not lose. Reifenhart was thinking about how difficult he was. He used to think that aura users were the worst opponents, but mages were just on a different level. Yes thought that he could still understand the reasons for such actions of someone who possessed an aura. Riffenhart realized that Yus had already realized everything, although he tried not to use his aura so as not to arouse too much suspicion. But he understood that even if Yus noticed, it would be better not to show it to her again. Yus thought that this level of ability was only possible when one had an aura, so he assumed that Reifenhart had awakened not so long ago, in which case he had every chance. Eustace began to cast a spell to awaken Eldred, to raise Eldrin, and to give him the strength to destroy everything in the world. Reifenhart realized that this was really dangerous. Eustace finished the spell and called forth the light of the Edril. Riffenhard concentrated his energy and used a spiral defense. A powerful explosion occurred. Yus couldn't believe he had blocked the Eldril light. Reifenhard had disappeared and thought he was a little late with the spiral defense. The commander-in-chief approached Yussus and asked if he was okay. Yussus ordered the relic to be checked to know exactly what he had stolen. He also ordered a search party to be sent out, as the thief could not be missed. The commander-in-chief asked if he really thought the thief had survived. Yussus replied that he definitely wouldn't die from something like that. Meanwhile, Cirrus couldn't fall asleep. She got out of bed and Scylla asked her what was wrong. Cirrus replied that she had a bad feeling. Scylla asked her what she thought happened to Rifen. Cirrus replied that she just had a bad feeling. Cirrus and Scylla were chased. Soldiers tried to capture them. The order was to corner them and block the roads. Cirrus grabbed Scylla under the arm and ran. Scylla asked her if she knew he was a man, as this scene was a bit humiliating for him. The commander reported to the knight that they were heading in that direction. Russ thanked him for his cooperation, surrounded Cirrus and Scylla. Russ said that they had nowhere else to run. It was time to throw down their weapons and surrender. Cirrus used Nylon. None of the soldiers could figure out what it was. Yussus appeared and asked Lot what was going on. Lot apologized and said that they were not ordinary criminals. Yussus ordered them to stop immediately and said that he would deal with them himself. Cirrus turned to Scylla, and he said that she could carry him further. At that moment, Scylla wondered when Rifen would teach him special training. Cirrus grabbed Scylla and ran. But suddenly Eustace appeared and said that the rats had enough of running. Cirrus realized that it was a golden knight. Yus noticed that Cirrus had a rather strange sword. He could not believe that Reifenhart would give such a weapon to an elf. Scylla began to cast a spell to make Philinitz give his faithful servant the courage of a lion. Eustace also noticed a high-level priest. Scylla continued to cast a spell to grant his loyal servant the strength of a giant, the gaze of a hawk, and the stamina of an ox to defeat the enemy. Scylla realized that Reifenhart had been caught after all, and Cirrus's premonition was not in vain. Yessus walked up to Cirrus and threw her back with one blow. Cirrus didn't even have time to react, came to his senses. Looking at himself, he said that he had been seriously battered, and that fighting with the owner of the strongest armor and holding back was damn stupid. But Riffenhart thought that at least he had gotten what he wanted, namely the voice of the illusion. Reifenhart could not understand where he was. Suddenly a dwarf appeared and asked if he was awake. Reifenhart was very surprised when he saw a dwarf in front of him. Then the dwarf introduced himself and said that his name was Hethos. Reifenhart also introduced himself, and Hethos said that he would soon have difficulty standing on his feet and offered him something to eat. Riffenhart didn't understand what was going on and nodded his head. Then Hethos asked Miss Tilla to bring some barley porridge. Riffenhart first thought that this girl was a child, but then he realized that she was an adult dwarf girl. Tilla is a dwarf warrior. She said she was glad that Reifenhart had come to his senses. Reifenhart was surprised, since dwarves are usually not so friendly to people. But as soon as the elder appeared, Reifenhart received an answer to his question. The elder priest of Alpat, Jelfa Delfstone, the elder told Riffenhard that 6 years ago the high priest received a message from Alpat himself, that a man with a body of steel and a great mind riding on the tears of the northern winds will come from the darkness itself, and they must follow him. He will be the one who will become the savior and change the course of fate. Secretly warned all the dwarves on the mainland, and Jelfad waited for this very savior every winter. Riffenhart smiled and thought that he had appeared again with his prophecies. Alpat is the god of all dwarves, sometimes sending them various messages. It was 6 years ago when Reifenhard was reborn, so Alpat sent the message right after, and even though he didn't succeed that time, he still supports him. What a wonderful creature. Reifenhard mentally thanked Alpat for believing in him and promised not to let him down this time. Riffenhard asked the elder if they had saved him simply because of this message. The dwarf replied that Alpat does not make mistakes. Tilla said that the wounds healed quite quickly. Riffenhart replied that it was all thanks to her. The girl was surprised, Because she was just making barley porridge, he would have recovered faster if there had been meat. Tilla asked what could be done to call the priest Jelfid, since he was feeling better. Riffenhard replied that he would find it himself. He noted that these dwarves were all of the Steelhammer tribe, mountain dwarves who lived in slavery in the lands of Viscount Kelberin. Unlike the orcs and elves, they managed to preserve their traditions and culture, and all because the dwarves, as slaves, are different from the first two. This race is only suitable for various engineering work, and humans are still unable to master their skills, and they work well only within their social groups. So when selling, the gnomes preserve their own culture. Their priests can still be found today, because they can believe in their gods. In his past life, Reifenhard owed much to the dwarves who helped him build his empire. They are the only races of their kind that understand how society works. Riffenhard asked Tilla how many there were. The girl replied that there were about 60, asked if they all belonged to the Viscounty of Kelberin. Tilla replied that they were all their slaves. Riffenhard said he saw no men. Tilla said they were usually busy in the mines deep in the Sellard Mountains. Reifenhard realized that in order to avoid a rebellion, the people had taken their families hostage. He apologized to Tilla for asking such a question. Tilla brought him to the priest. Jelfid said that Reifenhard looked much better already. Reifenhard thanked her. Jelfid said that although they did not know why he was dubbed a savior, Jelfid could tell from his eyes that he did not see them as slaves. Reifenhard replied that it was true, and he had good feelings towards the dwarves and saw them as equals. But changing the fate of an entire race was quite another matter. Jelfid explained that they still did not know why Alpod had chosen him to be their savior, and that they could only trust in his wisdom and do what they could. The prophecy turned out to be true, and of course, they do not know what their salvation is. But the main task of Jelfid now is to support him. Jelfid said that it was somehow strange that his words about the savior did not surprise Reifenhard at all, as if he already knew about everything. Reifenhard asked what they wanted to talk to him about. Jelfid said that the high priest wanted to meet with him. The high priest of Alpod, named McKellen. Riffenhard remembered that he was the pillar of all dwarfs. He was surprised that McKellen had been the high priest 30 years before this happened. Jelfid said it was very interesting. Riffenhard asked what it was, and the dwarf said he thought Riffenhard would treat it as if it were nonsense or gibberish, and he kept thinking about how best to convey the idea to Riffenhard. After all, people, unlike them, are not capable of hearing the truth. So Riffenhard's understanding is quite surprising. Reifenhard understood that the last time the Antares Empire had fallen, and they had every chance to repeat that experience. McKellen was a smart dwarf, and maybe it was worth talking to him about this. Reifenhard knew he should be at the Great Forge by now, not too far away. Jelfid confirmed this and said that only a few dwarves knew the location of the place, so Reifenhard will need a guide. Antilla is the only one of the tribe who still has warrior blood in her. Jelfid noticed that Reifenhard knew a lot about their race, and he heard the ringing of Reifenhard's mind. It sounded like Reifen knew the location of both the High Priest and the Great Forge. He also added that people who know about their peculiarity usually try to avoid it. Riffenhard replied that he knew. Jelfid was surprised and asked how he knew so much about their race. Reifenhard asked for forgiveness and said that it was not time yet. Suddenly Hedos burst in and started shouting, "Mr. Savior." The Jelfid asked what was the matter. Hethos asked Reifenhard if he had companions with him. Hedos said that it seemed they had been captured and sent to prison beneath Viscount Kelberin's castle. Yes told all the warriors that they had to find out where the criminal was hiding at any cost. And forget about honor, it didn't matter which attempts they chose. Yessis ordered to loosen the tongues of these accomplices by any means necessary. The main thing is to beat information out of them. Eustace thought of the elf with the enchanted sword that only a captain could afford, and the priest whose energy level was on par with an archbishop. He needed to extract information from them. The soldiers looked at each other and didn't know what to do. Just beat them? But that could kill them, so they decided to hurt them without killing them. One of them said that this was an order, and all that was left was to give it his all. Lento told Bars that he would be the first. 30 minutes later, Sillin was telling the soldiers that the Reifen clan was studying aggressive martial arts. He asked if they had heard about the training of the invincible warrior and the invincible King Gerard. And their training is so inhumane, and all this is just for training. Sillin said that he was sure that their training was not even close, and their final test was just absurd. Sillin said that, as you know, in his final test, he had to return a relic belonging to the Tense family. He asked if they had any idea what failure would have meant for him. Given the brutal training he had undergone, failure would have been sheer hell. So Reifenhard decided to steal it. After all, it originally belonged to their clan. And most likely, the king of martial arts did not count on the success of his student. After all, there is almost no information about those ruins. and they could have noticed that they stole only one artifact, and therefore they are innocent. Sillin claimed that the story was quite logical. Then his throat became dry, and he got tired of talking. The soldier gave him some water and asked what happened next. Sillin wondered if it was okay for him to listen to the chatter. The torture hadn't started yet. Then the soldier asked Sillin if it was okay that he was telling them everything, since they were friends. Sillin replied that it was not such a secret. The soldier said that if rumors spread that the martial arts king's disciple was a thief, the guy's reputation would be ruined. Sillin asked if he really thought Riffenhard cared about his reputation to do such a thing. The soldier said that now he understood, and it meant that they did not know where the relic was. Sillin replied that this was exactly the case, and they just had to wait for it. Suddenly, the soldier started shouting that something was wrong, and he was sure that they had a way to contact him in an emergency. Sillin replied that there was no need for that, since an aura user should be able to handle a simple theft without any problem. The soldier asked his partner if interrogations were really conducted like that. The partner shrugged and said that most likely they were. Riffenhart was on the road with Tilla. The girl was surprised that he caught the deer so quickly. Riffenhart said that the aura is very helpful. You just need to improve your senses to track down the animal. Professional hunters would be jealous. Riffenhart asked if everything was okay, since they were on contact lands and hunting was prohibited here. Tilla replied that she was not interested in that at all. Riffenhart thought that such things certainly shouldn't bother him. It was impossible to free all the races without breaking the law. Saving slaves is a crime in itself. Riffenhart started eating meat and said that he needed to recover faster. Tilla stood in shock. She noticed how Riffenhart's body was healing, and his aura was literally glowing, and said that he was now 100% ready. Yes was thinking that this was clearly not a simple coincidence. It couldn't be that out of all the relics he had taken this one by accident. Yusis remembered the situation that happened a month ago. A man came to him and asked if he was the Golden Knight of the Grain Kingdom. Yusis asked who he had the honor of speaking to. The man then took out a symbol and said that he believed that the true heir would recognize the symbol. Yusis learned that it was the Silver Hermit. When Yusis officially became the heir, his father revealed to him the secret that had been passed down from generation to generation, a group of people with the power to destroy entire nations. Hermits whose knowledge and wisdom are far ahead of modern times. They remain hidden in the shadows, never revealing their identity, and appear when a person is in danger. According to the stories, even kings are of average rank compared to them, which speaks of their absolute power. Then Yusis bowed and greeted the hermit. The hermit handed him a bundle and said that he entrusted him with the exploration of the ruins of illusion, and they could keep all the finds for themselves. All he needs is the voice of the illusion. And if he fails, the fate of the Tinham family will be sealed. Suddenly soldiers knocked, and Yusis ordered them to come in. They reported that they had finished the interrogation. They started to say that their story made sense, but it was a little strange. There was a guard at the entrance to the castle. One of the soldiers asked another if he was cold. He replied that he was just remembering yesterday's events, and who knew they would find something like this when they came to their senses. They wondered how ordinary soldiers could stand up to someone who could smash through armor with his bare hands. They hoped they would never see him again. After all, he had achieved his goal anyway. His partner said that Yusis had caught his comrades. Then the soldier took a deep breath and said that he hoped that, like last time, they would simply be knocked out. Suddenly one of the soldiers felt some kind of ominous energy. Riefenhard was already approaching, using the horn of distress. Yusis was surprised that the thief was a member of the Indestructible clan, and he wondered why the Silver Hermit needed an item of the Indestructible clan. Of course, can lie, but he is a pilgrim and a high-class priest, comparable in abilities to a bishop. Yusis did not believe that he was trained as a spy. Yusis was inclined to believe that the boy's words were true. He assumed that these two were just henchmen, and most likely he would come for them. Then Yus didn't understand how to catch him. Perhaps, if he used all available people, even if he managed to find him, but he wouldn't be able to return the voice of the illusion. And suddenly there was a powerful explosion. Yusis ran to the window to check what happened. Yus felt an incredible energy and realized that it was him. Meanwhile, Riefenhard said that he had heard that his friends were being held somewhere here. The knights had already come running. The commander-in-chief shouted for the knights of the Tense family to show this impudent bastard their strength. Riefenhard said that everything would be different from last night, including the fight with him. The commander-in-chief sent the rank-and-file knights first, but not even a minute had passed before they were already defeated. Riefenhard said that shields are useless against the aura, and it seems that they do not know how to fight its owner. The commander-in-chief ordered the priests to give a blessing for protection. They began to recite a spell to bestow a blessing on the subjects so that they would be stronger than steel. The knights rushed at Riefenhard one after another, but no one could stand for even a minute. The priests continued to cast spells to make the blades from the snowy land strike the enemy, and so that the flame becomes a bowstring, allowing you to hit the enemy, a fiery arrow. Riffenhart decided to take care of the mages first. He concentrated his energy and fired a volley of chi bullets. The shockwave scattered the mages and knights in different directions. They started screaming that he was a terrible bastard. Often mages lose concentration when they take minimal damage. But Riefenhart didn't expect everyone here to be such softies. Riefenhart continued to deal with each one. One of the knights told him to be a man, because he is an aura user, and this is the most cowardly tactic. Riefenhart wondered whether he was serious about cowardly tactics or not, since they themselves were attacking one person in a crowd. One of the priests asked for mercy, others shouted that he was a demon, and that he should immediately release Father Larkon. Riefenhart knew that there were priests whose powers increased the more damage they took, so it would be better to knock them out without causing serious injury. The soldiers noticed that he had become stronger since last night. Such was the power of an aura user. The commander-in-chief asked Russ why he was standing there, and said it was time to go into battle. The commander-in-chief thought, what a bastard, he always runs into battle headlong. But now he froze in his tracks. He told Russ that he would demote him, and when they returned home, he would become a peasant. Russ stood there motionless and thought about how she looked. Aura, control and replenishment of energy. Russ saw everything. He can notice why Riefenhart moves in one direction or another, and even the flow of his energy. Russ was shocked that he could see and understand everything so clearly. This was something he had never been taught, something that no one could teach him. Movements and breathing that only someone who had reached the pinnacle of martial arts could do. And all in a single flow. So this is how one should move in such a situation. This is what the movements of someone who is truly strong are like. But admire Riefenhart. Meanwhile, Justice appeared on the battlefield. Riefenhart said that he had been waiting for him for a long time. He said that in the name of the Tintz family he would not forgive the atrocities he had committed here. And he noticed that his soldiers were pretty battered. Riefenhart asked what kind of show he was putting on, and who had been watching him all this time. Riefenhart asked if Yes thought he wouldn't notice him while he sat on the wall, without interfering. Riefenhart suggested that the magical armor gave a power similar to that of an aura user, but did not enhance the senses. Said that he was sure that Justice simply wanted to evaluate his abilities. But he did not consider how cruel it was, who throws his subjects to be torn apart. Riefenhart also added that according to rumors he is an honest and fair knight. The soldiers began to discuss that it was impossible that Sir Yessus would do such a thing. Riefenhart asked the soldiers why he had come so late then. Even if he had taken a shower, he would have come running faster. Yessus replied that he had just dozed off, which was why he was late. Riefenhart asked how one could sleep during such pogroms. After all, he had broken down the wall. And he asked just whether he was a knight after all. Yus took out his sword and ordered Yus to shut up, as he would now make him pay for tarnishing the name of the Tintz family. Yus swung his sword and Riefenhart waved 2 fingers at him, challenging him to fight at full strength. Yus attacked Riefenhart and began to cast a spell to pierce the shadow in the eye of the Grim Reaper, and to strengthen the hands with the howl of the leopard. Yus shouted that thanks to the dragon's feelings, he would conquer this world. And may his sword be filled with a stream of purity. Riefenhart noticed that he had an arcana sword made entirely of pure mana. He thought that it would be a good test for the aura. Riefenhart knew that his body was strong, but it was not enough to stop the arcana sword. Justice struck and Riefenhart put up a spiral block. He then pounced on Justice and prepared to strike. Cirrus and Scylla were sitting in prison. Scylla asked what the noise was that wouldn't go away. Cirrus said that it could be Mr. Riefenhart coming to save them, and said that she tried so hard to be cold, but now she spoke as if she was waiting for him to save them. Cirrus began to deny and said that she did not understand why Riefenhart was so kind to her. Scylla assumed he had an elf fetish. Cirrus said she initially thought he was the type to roleplay. Scylla said that he certainly could be thought of that way. Cirrus said that when she looked into his eyes, she realized that the reason was not as simple as it seemed at first glance. Scylla replied that this was usually what women who were in love said. Cirrus said that she did not understand what he was talking about. Scylla explained that such women usually say that there is something unusual about him, that he is somehow special. After the wedding all you hear is what a bastard he is, and how wrong I was. Scylla said that the abbess at the orphanage told him so. Then he wondered what had happened in this woman's life that she would teach a child such a thing. Then Scylla started screaming that Riefenhart had screwed up, and now they were stuck here. Cirrus replied that he didn't look like he was angry about it. Scylla said that he had agreed to the job, so he was also to blame. He also said that living by the law doesn't always work out. Cirrus replied that he was more mature than she thought. Scylla said he would be 20 next year, only 3 years younger than Rifen. Cirrus was horrified and said that she thought there was at least a 20-year difference between them. Sillin replied that Riffenhard would cry if he heard that. Someone opened the door to the cell and asked if they were Sillin and Cirrus, and said her name was Tilla and she worked with Riffenhard, and she came to free them. Cirrus was very surprised to see the no. Cillian couldn't even string 2 words together. Tilla said that they would talk about it later, but now they had to leave. Sillin said that without ears she was indistinguishable from a human. Cirrus looked at him with disdain and asked if there was nothing else to notice. Cirrus continued to say that Sillin was still so naive and immature. Sillin asked who called him mature 2 minutes ago. The soldiers noticed that Riffenhardt's accomplices had fled. Cirrus immediately rushed into battle. One of the warriors attacked Cirrus from behind, but Tilla reacted in time. Sillin told Tilla that she was very strong. The girl was embarrassed and said that yes, the gnomes are famous for this. Then Tilla said they better hurry. She threw a bomb out the window, which exploded in the sky in a bright pink color. Riffenhard looked up at the sky and realized that she had managed to free Cirrus and Sillin. Yus realized that there was a dungeon on that side. He told Riffenhard not to say that he was just a decoy. Riffenhard laughed and said that was why he had not fought at full strength. And now it was finally time to fight. Yus asked angrily, did he really want to say that he didn't fight at full strength? The battle continued. Riffenhard used a chi bullet, which sent Jusis flying high into the sky. Yus understood that he absolutely could not lose. He continued to remain on equal terms. Jusis began to shout to make Eldrin howl. His sword shone even brighter, as if he had inhaled a new breath of air. Then Riffenhard used the fearless horn technique and said he felt no recoil. And suddenly Riffenhard found himself surrounded by many clones. And not just any clones. Riffenhard felt the presence of each one. Riffenhard thought that when it came to using the aura, Jusis would lack experience and knowledge, but he knows more than expected. Jusis began to cast a spell to awaken Eldrin and cast a destructive light upon the enemy. Riffenhard used the matter destruction technique and finally reached the real Jusis. Riffenhard struck and just couldn't understand how he had figured out the real him so quickly. Riffenhard thought that he was a depth mage, and it would be strange to miss the changes in the flow of mana. Yus said that he did not know what trick Riffenhard had just pulled, but the Sword of the Tense family would not be defeated. Jusis began to cast a spell to make the lights reunite and strike the enemy. Riffenhard used Spiral Defense, and Jusis cast a spell to cover the ground with Icy Fog. Riffenhard used his Spiral Defense again, and Jusis conjured the wind to become his arrows. Jusis asked the King of Winter to take over this land. Riffenhard blocked his every spell. Jusis got angry. He couldn't understand what kind of ability it was that could reflect all spells. Other aura owners are unable to use Spiral Protection. It is not that others cannot learn it, but quite the opposite. They can also cover their body like this, increasing their defensive stats, but this will disrupt their aura flow. They will be torn apart. Only those who practice the training of the indestructible warrior can withstand the recoil of this ability. But this consumes aura reserves in huge quantities. Jusis asked Riffenhard who was behind him and his deeds. Riffenhard joked and said that it seemed like Jusis' subordinate was standing behind him. Then Jusis got angry and asked Eldrin to open his eyes. He asked Eldrin to awaken and grant him the power to destroy everything in his path. The light of the Eldril awakened. Riffenhard realized that this was serious, and it would be better to use his strongest skill. Riffenhard concentrated and used the Horn of Disaster technique. Then he used the 4th stage of the Horn of Disaster.